All right, I'd like to call this unusual Saturday morning meeting of the Board of Education to order at 8:06. I will take a roll call at the moment. Let me just go through. Mr. Doherty?
Here.
Reverend Eiler?
Here.
I am here. Dr. Swetchnow?
Here.
Mrs. Washburn? Here. All board members are present. For those who are viewing us online, you can just barely see that we have some audience in the back. Looks like 5 folks back there. My view shows their heads cut off in the back row, but they are there. And we also have Adam Samuels here helping us with tech, and Mike Broadwater is here. We do not have our treasurer here with us today, so we do need, before we do anything else, to have a motion to appoint a treasurer pro tem. And so I would like to move that we appoint Mike Broadwater, our treasurer pro tem, for this morning.
Second.
And Mr. Doherty seconded. Any questions or comments? Basically, since the meeting's being recorded and streamed, Mr. Broadwater will just help keep notes for us, keep track of who votes on what. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried. Then we would have a motion to adopt the agenda. So can I have such a motion?
So moved.
Dr. Swetchnow moved. Is there a second? Second. And Mrs. Washburn seconded. This agenda was live on Board Docs. Nothing has been added. I think each board member has paper copies, and I believe we have paper copies for audience members. Unless there are any questions. The microphone is right in the center of the table, and then the camera is up there. And it is a stationary camera, stationary mic. So that's how we'll be recording today. Okay, can I have you vote on adopting the agenda? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried. There is an action item on the agenda, even though I had said and hoped when we set this meeting that we didn't need to, but there is one motion that we need to have. And so I will move that the board authorize submission of the modified tax budget to the Hamilton County Budget Commission. Is there a second?
Second.
Reverend Eilert seconded. The reason this is needed, this is what we've been doing for the past several years. There was an old form of submitting the budget, and then in recent years, we have been able to submit the 5-year forecast format as a budget, but the auditor still requests that we have a motion at the board level to waive that old form of the budget and allow this form. So that's all this is doing. It is the same budget that has been approved. It's just the format in which it is sent to the auditor. Any questions or discussion? All right. I think I'll have Mr. Broadwater call the roll on that one, just to make sure we have that one written down.
Mr. Doherty?
Yes.
Reverend Eiler?
Yes.
Dr. Lorenz?
Yes.
Dr. Swetchnow?
Yes.
And Mrs. Washburn?
Yes. Motion carried. Now, since most of our meeting then is discussion topics, I'm going to do my best if there's something that I need to turn around for or use my teacher voice. But I think everybody else is sideways here and hopefully can be heard by the audience there, but also picked up by the microphone here. Adam, are you able to tell the volume of the audio as it's going out?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
And for the benefit of the public, you did resolve the issue with the sound dropping out last week.
Yeah, so the company come out, take a look at everything. We made sure that there was basically a noise gate that was in place where if you were speaking too loud or too soft, that's what was cutting the mic. So they since have removed that, and it should be good moving forward.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Is that the case here in this room, or is that just
upstairs?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we do have some discussion topics. I am wondering, the way they got ordered on the agenda is to start with district finances. I am wondering, with board permission, if we can move that to the end. I think that might be a somewhat longer discussion. And items 3.2 through 3.6 are truly some procedural and discussion kind of topics that will not require any kind of vote or decision until the organizational meeting. So with the agreement of the rest of the board, I'm wondering if we could start with 3.2.
So the hope there would be that we'll march through these pretty quickly.
Yes.
And then we'll be able to not have this in the background, having the finance discussion.
Yes. And if I could also say that we will try to march through everything in good order. If we find that there are things that are taking a little longer, we may choose to wait till another meeting to deal with some of them so that we have time for the finance discussion and so that we have time to complete the meeting at 12 or before 12 if possible. And that's about all I can say. No. I don't have COVID. That has been tested. So, all right. So if we would start with 3.2, and that is a proposed board calendar. What you see on your agenda, what was published in board docs, is a combination of sort of our regular schedule, which is the first and the third. Am I correct? The first and the third Tuesday of the month. A work session and a regular session. Then there's the organizational meeting. And then when you get to the end for December, it notes that either we won't have a meeting in December or we would have a session similar to this. There was some discussion about whether Saturday worked or not. So there's an offer of December 5th, which is a Tuesday evening, or December 9th, which is a Saturday like today. It's also noted on there that May 2nd is the regular day for a work session. That happens to be the May election day. Added into this are two meetings, January 19th and January 31st, that might be needed depending on what happens in the finance discussion and whether the board talks about levy scenarios for 2023. What would also be needed for an August, let me get my notes out here. If there were an August issue, there probably would be a meeting. April 18th and May 2nd would work to fit with the levy date requirements. If the board considered a November levy, then we would need meetings in July to meet the August 9th deadline for levies. So some of those dates are dependent on what happens with the finance discussion. But I felt more comfortable giving the January dates as possibilities there and then saving the discussion of July meetings until later as we move along and what the board decides, since we haven't had any time to discuss this at all until this point. So you see the dates there. I put them out ahead of time. Has anyone seen any issues, conflicts with any of those dates? Do those have anything to do with family, with scheduled meetings, those kinds of things?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
There are issues.
Yeah. So the February 7th meeting, I will be in the Holy Land, so I will not be here. So I don't, I see we've got those two back-to-back, the 31st and the 7th.
Right.
So I can be here the 31st, but I can't be here the 7th. So if we're at some point trying to decide between the two, or however we end up doing that, the 31st.
And does the 21st of February work?
Yes, 21st I'll be back.
Okay.
But I'll be back.
All right. Anything else?
I'll be groggy. Oh, and then in the summer, I've got a sabbatical this summer. So June to August, I'm going to be fairly sketchy. And that June date that we currently have on there is a date where I'll be gone. Because I've got several trips that are part of that. But that's going to be hard for me to make a summer meeting period.
The June 27th date, in general, we try to push the June date as far back as possible for the end of the year. for the financial issues that we try to handle at the end of the year. But
And
it
the
sounds,
fiscal year.
and the fiscal year, yes. So are there other dates in June that would work for you, or is June problematic for you no matter what we did?
Let's see. The week of the 12th would be the week that I'd be in town for sure.
Okay, and I'm afraid that would be too early for books to be closed and those kinds of things.
Yeah, the HR by July 10th, we've got to make our final decision. So you try and push that as
So there's a good
close.
chance I'm just
Is there
gonna
anything that
miss
we need
the
a
summer.
supermajority for in the timeframe?
I don't believe so. The only thing you would need a supermajority for in there is if there happen to be any HR issues, which the board was desiring to not follow the superintendent's recommendations for hiring. Superintendent recommends the HR issues,
To override,
and you
that,
need a supermajority to override the superintendent's recommendation.
which means 4 in
Four.
favor of the opposition.
Just for clarity, and not that I care too much, because that sounds like a pretty edge case.
Right.
The if there's only 4 members there, is a supermajority 3? Because it's
No, it's
the
four.
members who
No,
are
it's
there.
it's the majority of the super.
It's
It's 4 votes.
Right.
Have to be the 4 votes of the 4 people who were there. So it's obviously doable. But again, that's an edge thing. My concern more would be
What
the
about
July
July?
time.
Right.
If we were talking about, if we were still talking about levy scenarios there, my concern would be the need for July meetings. So will you be out of town in July?
I will, but I think the week of the 17th in July should definitely be safe. Probably the 24th, but we're still finalizing one of our last trip, and so that one's iffy. Yeah.
Okay.
So 18th or 25th should work, but Tuesdays, right?
Everybody else okay?
Okay. Anybody else have any conflicts?
Too soon for me to tell you what's going on in my summer.
So you're just going to
We'll just
change,
roll.
you're just going to throw wrenches in
Exactly.
the
I mean, most things I can work around.
Yeah. Okay.
On
Well-
March 21st, I don't. That's when I'm on spring break. If I can find a good deal somewhere, I may be out of town. It's probably a stretch, but
Right. Okay. Okay. Let me look into the February 7th work session, because that was put on there simply because that's a normal schedule. And if we add if we have a 19th and a 31st meeting, then there may not be a need for the 7th. I don't know that there's anything I can do with the June 27th.
Right.
I'll check with the
Right.
financial department and find out. And then I will, March.
probably end up being here, so don't put too much thought and effort into that one.
Nothing in that timeframe you need a supermajority for either.
No, it shouldn't be.
So if you weren't here, we could get work done.
All right. All right, well, let me look into those, and then what will happen with these is they will be on the organizational meeting agenda. The only one that is set is that January 10th, and then what we do at the organizational meeting is set the rest. So you'll have a little more time to think. Eric, if you want to make some plans for all those meeting dates, you can bring it out at the organizational meeting. But those will be voted on at the organizational meeting.
Sounds great. Is it worth it to try to game plan days in July so that we can get those on calendars? And again, to go back, I can work around most things. But and again, we don't need to do that today, but in January, when we're setting this, is it worth at least putting down potential for those days in July?
They would need to be, there's an August 9th deadline for the November election. So
And we need 2 meetings
two
before that.
meetings. Mhm.
So we could do we don't have anything scheduled for July.
No.
And we don't need all of us. We only need 3 out of 5.
It also needs a super majority, so we
Right.
need 4 board
Okay.
members.
So I think we can count on Jonathan possibly not being around in July. It's just important that we kind of
So
figure
you
that
might
out.
become critical.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm happy to put dates out there which can be canceled.
Right.
The only issue I would ask about, if you want me to slot some dates in there, the first Tuesday is July 4th,
Yeah,
so
that's
we won't do
probably
that one. The third Tuesday is the 18th, and August 1st is a Tuesday. Would you want me to?
That's, I mean, I'm open to conversation about it. I think it's probably better for us just to at least get a temporary date on the calendar.
I
I agree
agree
with
with that. I think it's
So
better to have
perhaps-
it and cancel it. if we
Perhaps
don't
July
need it.
18th and August 1st?
Mhm.
All right. I can do that, and I will check with the treasurer's office to make sure those fit, and I'll put those on for the organizational meeting as well.
Right now, 18th is fine. It's the first when
First would be-
I'm probably going to be traveling.
Okay,
So again, everything except for the 10th is proposed until we get to the
Yep.
10th.
yes,
Sounds good.
yes, and they will be set then on January 10th. All right, the next discussion item is board officers and administrative committees. This is, again, something that will be taken care of at the organizational meeting, but just open for board discussion, folks to give their opinion, their thoughts on duties that they would like to have next year. And so I'll just open up the table to people taking turns and saying what they would like to do.
I'll kick it off. The VP slot, as I said to several of you, has helped me get things done. Most of the work that I do is outside of this room, and some of it's facilitated by being in meetings that the VP is in. So it's been useful to me. I have a good deal of concern about organizational development, as I kind of said, since I arrived here, and that extends into the board. So making sure that there are opportunities for board members to have experiences that help them grow and prepare for other roles within the board. I'm very sensitive to that as well. Nothing is for sure. But at this point in time, I don't have plans on pursuing reelection next year. So we'll see what happens. But right now, likelihood that I won't be here in 24, and that would mean that there's an opportunity in 23 for somebody to gain experience by sitting in this chair. So I'm a little betwixt and in between on this because it is a tool for me to do things. I'm not sure how I will do what I intend to do, not sitting in this chair, but I think the greater issue is board development. So I'll just put it out there. That's the kind of stuff that's going on in my mind. I think I've done an okay job in this role, but I don't think I'm the only one to do it.
I could tag on to that and say that at this point, I also do not have the intention to run for reelection in November. That being said, there have been times in the past when no one has been running or no one has intended to run. And I felt like we need board members, but at this point, I do not intend to run again in the fall, but I am willing to serve in any capacity that the other board members would like me to. I do find great pleasure in organizing the agenda and whipping the rest of you into shape.
We appreciate that.
But
We do.
that's what I feel the role of the board president is to make sure that the meeting runs well. Occasionally, the board president is called on to give a statement. In my opinion, any statement that the board president gives is a statement of something that has happened due to board action or something that has happened where the entire board has asked that statement to be made. In general, I don't feel there is a place for just because you have the title of board president or board vice president, you don't get to make statements that are not representative of the whole board. But other than that, I really feel like the board president role is to work with the superintendent and the board vice president to get the agenda set and make sure that the work gets done that needs to get done. So be willing to do that, but I'm certainly understanding that there are 5 of us here, and so I'll just let you know that. I have been assigned as representative to Great Oaks. That's already assigned. I'm happy to continue serving as the policy committee, on the policy committee, however you would like that. But if someone would like that role to learn, I still feel like there's some work to do to get that cleaned up, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So
If I maybe I'm a little out of turn here, but if I could add a little something to Kathy's remarks, just by sitting in this job and sitting next to her and whatever, part of it is that I think I've only chaired 1 meeting, maybe I've chaired 2, and that is a totally different job than participating in the meetings. Those are that 1 or 2 meetings was the one you didn't hear a lot of me, right? Because your focus is on managing the meeting. It's really hard to contribute in other ways. That's been my experience. So if you are interested in the presidency, I understand. I think that's a little bit of a challenge with the job. The other thing is what my career have always called institutional knowledge. All the nuances of the way things work, all the details, et cetera. Kathy is a fountain of that kind of stuff. So there's only a few people that you have a question and you say, how does this work? Or if Mr. Giuffre was here, he's one of those people that you would go, how does this work? Mike, sometimes we'll ask you because you've been doing this for 34 years or something. 36 years, sorry. So the point is that organizational knowledge that she has is very important.
Mike, we can ask, how does this generally work? Kathy, we can say, what did we do in 1994?
So when you think about architecting the officers' thoughts for next year, I think one of the knowledge transfers has to come from Kathy to whoever hopefully would become officers down the road. Of course, what would it be, 2024, this group doesn't get to call that, right? If Kathy's not here, if I'm not here, the dynamics of that process could be totally different. So who knows, but arm ourselves with the best preparation possible, I think would be the advice.
Yeah.
anybody else thoughts on?
Is there a
President,
role
Vice
for
President?
advisor to the president after 2024? All kidding aside, even the tiny things that you do, like, hey, we have the meeting at the end of June because by then all of the fiscal stuff is in order. Like, we will tremendously miss your knowledge.
I'm not going yet.
Good.
And she left the door open.
Right. I saw that. I'm just hoping nobody else runs.
So what else? Who else wants to?
The idea of this discussion is just to, I always use the term warm the skillet, get us thinking about.
I gotta get us a skillet. Let's use that term a lot. I need a skillet.
So it's just getting us ready rather than plopping it on the table in January. No decisions obviously today, but just getting everybody thinking about it.
Well, I just, and again, in the spirit of warming the skillet, I am more than happy to serve those roles, one of those roles for the period of time that I'm left here. I am more than happy to support anybody who's willing to spend the enormous amount of time that it takes to do that as well. Just to think over how we want to do it.
Yeah, and I had indicated I'm willing to serve in that vice president role next year. I do think Kathy is great as the president. I think I would love to see her assuming that she does finish her time next year, that, to finish that out as the president, because I think she served so well there. And in that kind of development frame that Kevin was saying, that would be the reason to potentially do that. Otherwise, I think Kevin's done a great job as vice president too. So there's no reason I think we need to switch for the sake of switching. But if we did something different, I think that would be the reason.
I agree with all of that. I'm also willing to step into the role. I just worry with my work schedule and lack of availability during the day and the week that I wouldn't be able to attend the appropriate meetings.
Okay.
If you do pursue those officer jobs, there's at least guaranteed one extra meeting prior to every board meeting. And depending on what's going on, there's all kinds of other things that you get involved in behind the scenes. So just getting things set for a meeting.
I do have a plus, like I could walk to a meeting here from my office. I didn't do so.
Sold.
How about the student achievement representative, legislative liaison, the committee appointments? Anybody thoughts on, staying where you are, changing where you are?
Eileen, are you the student achievement person right now? Your role?
Yes. I was looking.
Are you receiving student achievement and legislative? Are you receiving?
I'm
anything?
receiving legislative.
You should be receiving an OSBA communication for student achievement, and legislative, they send you things.
I'll get back to you.
All right. Well, if you think about it, what I might bring in January to the organizational is the current setup, who is where, unless I...
Which of us are on what committees?
Right. Just bring that to the meeting, and if there's a desire to change before we set it up, we can do that. I believe it's... I know the student achievement and legislative liaison. On facilities, it's Kevin and Eric. Finance, the same.
Yep. And I don't know how you feel, Eric, but to me, this is the place that I add value. Right. So I would prefer to stay on both.
It's probably of value of somebody else to join you on the policy committee.
Probably. I don't see anyone at the table to do it.
But and again,
desire to drop.
right, as I say, it's someone has to do it, and I would be happy to join.
I appreciate that. It puts you on a lot of committees, but
It's okay. The facilities committee usually is pretty easy.
again, our aim right now is to get things back in order.
Yeah.
I think before we had it policy-wise, before we had a couple of changes in superintendent, a couple of treasurer changes, I think we were keeping things in order. I think there have been some difficulties with the consultant we have for policy. I think there's been a desire on the part of this board to streamline things a little. And I believe that in 2023, we should be able to get that streamlined, and then it should be a little less of an onerous job. That would be my aim anyway, to help us get there. All right, I'll bring that on on January 10th. The next one is board appointees to Loveland City committees. And we have the CIC, Community Improvement Commission.
Yep.
Planning and zoning, recreation, and then let's save city liaisons for the end. But those three, CIC, planning and zoning, and recreation, currently CIC and recreation are appointees whose terms are not up, if I am correct.
Right.
And then planning and zoning, we do have an opening. Mr. Kressler, who has served the district and the city as planning and zoning, has indicated that he is resigning. And so this board needs to recommend a planning and zoning commissioner to the city of Loveland. The city actually makes the appointment because it's their commission. It needs to be a city resident. So we have had the treasurer put out a notice that we intend to do that and ask people to send us a letter and a brief resume stating that they are interested. The question that comes before the board is, how do we take care of that issue? I'm caught on a cord here. Do we wait till January 10th and have the board review everything? Does the board wish to have perhaps facilities or finance or president and vice president review whatever applicants there are and bring a recommendation to the board in January? That's the question before us right now. We don't have, we may have one applicant already, but I don't know that for a fact.
Planning, we have two.
We have two now. And so there may be two or three, so there will be a decision that needs to be made. So thoughts about how we don't have in policy a specific way to do it. We recommend, and you can do it the whole board, you can do it with a smaller group and bring a recommendation.
What deadline was put out there for the applicant?
I think it was the 14th. I believe it was December 14th.
You know, just thinking procedurally, facilities would make the most sense. That's what it's related to most directly. But
Yeah, I'm happy to look over and talk over that. That's an easy thing to do.
And I think finance works with that as well. I mean, it has to do a lot of the things that planning and zoning does impact the finances of the district.
So if we reviewed
Right.
the resumes and then made a recommendation perhaps at the January 10th meeting for the board to decide, that's what we're saying.
Sounds good.
It's the 14th.
It's 14th.
Yeah, I thought that it was the 14th.
Does anybody know the structure of the planning and zoning committee and how, I mean, obviously we have a representative. How many people are on that committee? Kathy.
I'm trying to count as I see. I've been to their meetings.
it's relatively small, right?
It's either 5 or 7.
That's fine. I was just
Yes.
getting
I was
it.
thinking 5, but
I think it's,
And one of my frustrations, and you've heard this from me before, is that the city has made decisions in the past that were detrimental to the school district. And I'm not sure in the past how much the city was told that by our representative. This is well before my time, and specifically about the TIF financing district in downtown. So I just want to know how much we have the ability to pressure the city to keep our point of view. And it sounds like pretty minimally, really.
It's not a voting position,
Right.
correct?
no, it is.
oh, it is.
It is
Yes,
a-
it is a full-fledged member. In answer to that, I would say that 5, it is 5, Kevin.
Okay.
I mean, Mike, confirmed. In answer to that, I would say that the TIF and the tax abatement, those kinds of things generally come before the board if state law allows them to. In other words, there are many things that cities are allowed to do without approval of a school district. Townships are allowed to do without board input. And it has less to do with planning and zoning than it has to do with city government in general. Planning and zoning has its own rules that it has to follow, and then what it recommends or decides goes to city council. So city council would have the ultimate ability not to. We are in less of a situation now than we used to. The Grailville-Dries proposition was somewhat rare in recent times because there's just not that much property
To plan
that
and
can be
zone.
developed.
So when you think about this role, would I be correct in then assuming that somebody who gets out of their skin, networks, pushes, cajoles, is likely to be more effective than
And that's really why I ask, if we're going to be selecting someone, what am I looking for?
I mean, the challenge is they're serving on the city zoning, so they're officially appointed by this. They're our representative.
Right.
They're there, and then we want them to have the school's interest, but they're also serving the city. So they're in that.
Two masters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So that it's going to be a
One
challenge.
of their crucial roles is to make sure that the school board is aware of issues that are coming before planning and zoning and before the city, so that if there is any input that the board could have, there's an opportunity to do that. And one of the challenges over the years has been to ensure that that communication comes to the board. We have asked for regular
Updates.
We have gotten a few. We've gotten, frankly, I'll tell you that we've gotten a few maybe misleading ones that, we just weren't. So I think it's important that this person be able to communicate and be able to understand a bit about, I think there should probably be an initial meeting with the board and this representative explaining what kinds of things impact the school district, and then setting up some sort of regular reporting schedule.
It's just a challenge. Al's been a regular part. You know, he was on the planning commission on the facilities piece. And he did that, prior to the last, or the bond issue that whenever all of that work happened. So he's done a lot of work with the district too. And even yet, there wasn't always apparently the communication we felt.
Well, and even going back before his time serving on the role, I would assume good. I just wanted to make sure that I understood the dynamics of that.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back into the work that you've done already, Mike, which is, it sounds like our better way to ensure that the school district's voice is heard in the city is by direct relationships with the city.
Mm-hmm.
And that the main role of this person is to help to provide those relationships and to keep us informed.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. The reason I added city liaisons to townships, it got in there kind of incorrectly. We have had in the past, in addition to committee assignments for board members, we've had one board member who was a liaison with Sims Township, one who was a liaison with Miami Township, one who was a liaison with the city. The issue with that is that the city meetings are generally the second and fourth Tuesday, and ours are generally the first and third. So that's a possibility to have a relationship there. The township meetings, Miami Township has one Monday meeting, but it's a Monday morning meeting. I think that's like their work session. And their meeting is the third Tuesday. And I believe Sims Township meeting is also the third Tuesday. So we ran into problems of our representatives not ever being able to attend meetings. I added this to this in case this board wanted to officially or unofficially appoint a board member who was a representative to try and create that liaison with the city, Miami Township, Sims Township. We could always try for Hamilton Township in Warren County, but that's a very small part of our district. There's a teeny tiny corner of, I forget what township, I guess it's Goshen Township. Goshen Township that's I forgot which township it was. But so we could each have one to be representative too. But the main ones, I think, are the city, Miami, and Sims. And I just wanted to ask if you had an interest in trying to set that up. Or if the other thing that we do then is depend on the superintendent to create those relationships and connections for us.
To me, and I'm in Miami Township, so to me, it's a valuable thing to do, but we're also spreading ourselves pretty thin by saying, okay, now do this as well. Like, for instance, Monday mornings, I can't do that. The third Thursday, if we don't have our meeting, we can do that. But how many times per year is that? And do they meet in the summer?
It's Tuesday. I think that Sims and Miami both conflict with our regular meetings. I think if I said Thursday, I think I meant Tuesday.
Right. And then if we switched, we would conflict with Loveland.
Right.
Yeah. So, I think it's valuable. I think it's probably better to leave that role to the superintendent. I don't see it being feasible for us to make much progress, to be present enough to have value.
Right.
I agree with
Other
that.
thoughts? All right. Then the last.
Sorry, Kathy, one more thing. I apologize.
Yeah, that's right.
And this goes back to you again. I think that's important to bring up, and I think it's important to continue to bring up in the future. You're probably one of the few people who know about that, so thank you.
I've been to a few of those meetings. And it's an interesting experience, I will let you know. If you ever get mad at any of them, most of them you cannot slam their doors when you leave their meetings. It's probably a good thing. If they ever annoy you at all, you cannot,
Wonder what brought that up.
you cannot make a grand exit. It's not possible.
Did you learn that the hard way?
Not so grand.
Do they all have the big dais kind of thing? I've heard some stuff.
Yes, and Miami has a dais as well. So, yeah. Okay, a little bit of discussion about meeting processes, recordings, and minutes, and that will kind of bleed over into bylaws because bylaws are where we organize what our meetings do and things. Just a sort of a check on how things are going. How you are getting the agenda, how the meeting seems to be going, how we are recording the meetings. Maybe a lot to discuss there, maybe just a little. I mean, we keep trying to fine tune it. But if anybody would like to start a conversation on what we're doing and how we could do it better or differently, this is the place to have a little discussion of it.
So I like what we're generally doing. I think we've gotten better at the recording part of it. I don't expect perfection. I don't think anybody should expect perfection. But I think we're getting better with some of the technical nuances that kind of bit us once in a while. I think having the video out on YouTube is very good. I know I use it a number of times, go back and see what was actually said about things. Eric's suggestion that we've had in place for probably 6 months now of timestamping and cross-referencing back to the agenda, I think is very, very useful. I would say the only thing that continues to bother me a bit, and I know we didn't have a great experience when we tried it, is interactivity with the public. And I don't know the right format for it. I already apologized to everybody for going outside the lanes and having things get a little haywire, but I thought it was important to do. I'll probably do it again, and you get mad at me again, but that's okay.
We will.
My heart's in the right place.
That's why we don't get really mad. Because your heart's in the right place.
If I could slam the door there.
But I would like to still have something where we can, actually go back and forth a bit. I'm still troubled by that, but that's the only hesitancy I have.
Well, and Jonathan, I know you were at the state meeting of school boards. And I think, did you participate in a session specifically about that?
I did.
Uh-huh.
I did.
Did you get any learnings from that were helpful for our situation?
I mean, one of the things that's just interesting to hear the different ways that different districts have organized the time. I mean, no district allows for the back and forth. That's just kind of considered a non-thing at a meeting. I think there are opportunities. I think one of the things we should think about if we want more time like that is, do we want to schedule some town hall kinds of meetings where it's more specifically to listen and have dialogue. And I think we could schedule those a few times a year if we wanted to. But the challenge and one of the things that some districts do is because we have an agenda for each of our meetings, and sometimes we get too long, and that's when I start to get frustrated. I realize we're shortchanging the prescribed agenda that we have, things that we said we know we need to accomplish, we know we need to discuss, and then some other topic is brought forward, and suddenly we're discussing that topic, and at the front end of our meeting, that's not germane to the agenda, and now we're having less time to talk about the agenda items. So one of the things some districts do is they say, if you have comments germane to the agenda, the public comments can be made at outset, and a number of them still adhere to the half hour, but they split it in half. So there's 15 minutes of public sharing at the outset of the meeting for issues germane to the agenda. And then if you want to speak to non-germane issues, then those come at the end of the meeting, that there's an additional 15 minutes for people to make comments about something that is an addition. That they're concerned about. And that way, then you're not as tempted to try and pull those non-germane issues into the dialogue.
Did you hear if anybody that well, I guess maybe you answered it, but interactivity with the public, is that the town hall kind of thing?
Yeah, and so.
And was there much discussion about that? Because, and again, not just, I want to hear both of your thoughts, but I'm kind of stuck in the middle because I think it's a valuable service for us to offer the ability to have conversations with the public. I don't feel like that's the right time to do it, but I'd like to make sure that we have the ability to. So maybe it's a split thing, and at the end, we do that a little bit more. Or maybe it's a separate town hall. So go back to like what?
Right. So generally, none of them, they're always limited to those comments that, you know, the same way that we do it, that you give them a certain number of minutes that they can speak. I think one of the challenges we've had that where we need to think through is that the additional minutes afterwards, that seems to be where we generally get into a place where we end up in some dialogue situation instead of we seem better about in those initial 3 minutes of sticking to them simply being comments from the public. So, you know, not every district allows for a second speaking. It's simply you have 3 minutes to speak. So that's something else that I think, you know, we could look at as a way for as much for our own self-discipline as the discipline of others to make sure that we're sticking to the agenda.
To me, that's the key of it. And this goes back a little bit to the policy conversation. So like you make a policy and you should generally try to stay with that policy instead of just freewheel, which I feel like we do sometimes in the interest of accommodating people.
Right. And one of the challenges then that this was a legal counsel that was presenting this. One of the challenges is that because you have policies on these issues, you can get yourself in trouble if we're having we're picking dialogue with one person on one particular topic and we're not choosing on another. Now, I think one of the things we've been good about is it's often when we've been challenged on stuff that we're in dialogue instead of simply being in dialogue with people that are saying things we like. And so then we're going to have a conversation with them. That's where you're more likely to get yourselves into trouble, that we're going to converse with people that we're happy with what they're saying. And we're going to just shut off people that we're not happy. That's where you're most likely to get yourselves into trouble. But the best, from a policy standpoint, the best practice is to be consistent. It's a hearing of the public. It's simply listening to them, saying thank you, and then moving on to your stated agenda.
So the flip side, a little bit in the town hall scenario, one of the issues that we talk about is that there's no way to get the board to speak because the board is a collective. It's a legal entity, right? So the board can't speak except by agreement that this is what we are going to say. So you can't have an interactive discussion with the board. I still want to think that you could have an interactive discussion with board members, and the caveat that anytime one of us speaks, it's personal
speaking
opinions.
For myself,
right?
I'm certainly and have always been more of an adherent to the fact that our regular business meetings where we have public participation or hearing of the public, those are our meetings held in public. They are not public meetings. So we should be adhering to our policy. We should be listening, obviously, but it is only one opportunity that we have now with the proliferation of ways for people to contact us, and principally the ease of contacting us by email, contacting all of us at the same time. We can hear things that way. And we have been trying to indicate those things that we're hearing in a meeting. So I'm more of a fan of, and we did try to have, unfortunately, I think COVID didn't help us much, did try to start this process. The Planning Commission tried to start this process for us as well. I know that I went to one, I went to one of the,
Right. Planning Commission outreach. Right.
it was an outreach that they wanted to do. And at first I was thinking, I don't really want to do that. But I went to one of them. But besides people who were on that committee and me, there was one person who attended. Now, again, I think we're hampered by everybody's schedules are busy. COVID came in there and gave us trouble. But I think it's worth trying again to have a public meeting where it is more, the public feels freer to say what they want. I still think the public needs to be understanding of what Kevin just said, which is anything that an individual board member says is being said as an individual. We can't speak for all five of us unless we're simply reporting something that has happened.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm thinking as just like a participant in the public, a frustration would definitely be standing up there and speaking and then not getting any response. And I agree with you that it's our meeting, but I think maybe if we add a statement of how can I get a response then, or how can I address this issue, and
Right.
avenues you can do that, or we can post responses, or.
Well, I've taken the time to come to this meeting and tell you what my concerns are, and I'd like some feedback about my concerns rather than it just disappeared into the ether.
I'm going to think that there's nothing that prevents us from having listened to the public, getting through that, taking some time on the agenda to have some discussion about what we just heard, and maybe being able during that to respond if we can. I mean, sometimes a question is asked that we know the answer to, but we don't have a mechanism necessarily to answer it. Sometimes we don't know the answer, right?
I worry a little bit about trying to do that during the meeting. I also am concerned, the thing that you mentioned, that there is a tendency, and I try to be pretty careful about it. There's a tendency to thank those who say something you liked to hear, and to forget to thank those who said something you don't like to hear. And I try to be careful to thank everyone. But the issue is that we frankly have occasionally had people who come and just say something that's
Bothersome to them.
yes, and we're not able to respond to it in an official way. It's not asking for an action. It's telling us something that's wrong with us, or even telling us something that's good about us. And then, coming up with at that meeting a response is sometimes difficult.
Well, so I agree completely about the idea of having a free-form interactive chunk of the meeting is difficult and problematic. But I also think that although your example is a good one, those don't necessarily need a response. I came up and I made a statement and I wanted you to hear it is different than I'm worried about our graduation rates and I don't understand why it's reported this way. So there is an opportunity with some of those comments to try to make a more formal way that they get responded to. And I don't think a more formal way is, let's just talk about that right now.
Right. Just generally not as productive because we're not prepared to answer that issue at that time because it's not been on our agenda. So we're going to give a better and more complete answer later than we are in that moment. Too.
Most of the time when I've stepped into this, that's what I'm trying to do, right? It's as a board member to try to say, hey, Mike, can you make sure that we answer this question at a future meeting when you've had a chance to research it, whatever, right? Sometimes I've taken it too far, I get it. But I wonder, we have a policy that allows for a meeting that's really dedicated to hearing the public, I believe, right? Is there anything in that policy that precludes us from having a conversation with the public as individual board members, do you think?
You mean in a meeting format?
In a communications meeting, in a meeting.
So actually set up a meeting.
Just
Here in the public town hall, right? People come to the mic, they make their statement. We as board members elect to engage or not to engage, whatever. but it's us as board members as opposed to the board engaging. Thank you. Who's us from doing that?
We already have, really. I mean, when we did the long range planning, I mean, that had some little more formality to, structure wise, but in essence, particularly the earliest meetings,
Right.
it's essentially what we were doing. That, it was come let us know what you think the issues are that we have as a district, and let's get all those on the table so we can begin to think about which ones we think are.
There's nothing
highest priority.
by policy or by law that precludes a board member from saying anything they want, frankly. But here's the caveat. When you get in those back and forths in a situation where you're not prepared for them, the tendency is either to give an answer that you think, and then later you say, oh, I was wrong about that, or to say, Mike, can you do something about this? And I don't think it's correct to, off the top of our heads, it's not always Mike either, to give our administrators work like, okay, Garth, we need you to figure out this. Okay, Jesse, we need you to figure out this. I think it's those kinds of responses are better discussed as a board and a board decision, asking the superintendent or the director of teaching and learning to enter into a study. And we do tend to do that. We say, can we have a report on this? It's not a direct response to the person who asked the question, but it's a report to the board that attempts to answer the question. Again, I'm not trying to prescribe or proscribe anything we do, just
Right, but building off
giving
of
the
that,
notions.
just building off of that, we could have a session. Board members could have some back and forth. Nothing necessarily wrong with that. Judgment call, whether you want to get into this or not, whether you're prepared to get into it or not. But then we could, as board members, turn back to the board and say, I think an appropriate action based on this is to ask the administration to do thus and such.
Right.
And I do agree with you. I'm guilty of this in the past. I do agree with you that I shouldn't be telling Garth to do something. I should be asking Mike to do it, and because Garth reports to Mike, and that's the way that should go. But even that, I mean, I shouldn't be telling Mike. The board should be telling Mike, we think you should go do thus and such.
Well, and then if we're doing that, does that going to require a formal action? And I'll just bring up, I'm a concerned citizen, and I want to know what our head count is and what it's been over the past 10 years. And we don't have that information right away. And you want to say, Mike, can you get that information from Garth for this community member?
Yeah.
Will we need to have a vote of the board?
I just personal opinion here. If we all nod our heads and Mike nods his head as I'll take care of it, there's a commitment that's made without a formal motion.
That kind of information is stuff that if someone were to call the board office, they're going to provide to a community member, because they're serving the public, they're serving the community.
And I just made up an example,
right.
but maybe something that's harder to do.
Yeah. But I think there are delineations there, that, well,
I
this
think
is.
a motion has more teeth, is what I would say.
But I think a lot of times
that,
I think we get bogged down in a lot of procedural stuff if, again, for some of those, given the fact that some of those are simple answers that are going to be provided anyway, why do we need to take?
Well, and is that something that we want? And then to go back, let's say it's a more complicated question and we're all like, that's a silly question. We don't want to waste Mike's time on that. But you don't necessarily want to do that right there. So, but we don't have the opportunity to talk to each other outside of board meetings to make that decision.
I mean, we're dealing with hypotheticals here to the extreme, right? And there are going to be some that our judgment, real time, is we can deal with that one. There are some that maybe we just look at each other and go, there's no answer to this, or it's. Don't know how to address this one, and let it go, having heard it.
I'm thinking back on the town hall thing. I do think those can be helpful. Thinking back on my experience on a university board, particularly when there were contentious things that decisions that were made, it would often be as the chair of the board, I would go back a week after a board meeting with the president, and we would have an open forum for folks to come and it was about so it wasn't where I wasn't speaking out of turn. I was, trying as best I could to explain actions taken by the board. So it wasn't, what's Jonathan's opinion? Here's what the board did. Here's why we did that, why we think that's important. And the president as well, giving similar kinds of reports. So, I've been a part of those meetings. I think you can have, you can speak in that way as long as you're careful to not try to speak for the board about things the board hasn't taken action on. So I think that can be, and it's, again, I think a more helpful forum in which to do that.
Prior to COVID, what we had talked about were town halls where we had a monthly focus, so we could come prepared with some information, and the recommendations could come from the public. So like we had talked about 1 month, the focus of the town hall being safety in the schools, another month, curriculum concerns or questions. I mean, that's something we can consider too. And
it's a point that I was going to make. I understand what you're saying, and I think it's a very good idea. I am often concerned that we do hear things from the public, but then we make action and we hear more from the public after we take action,
right?
Because it's something that either has pleased people or not pleased people. Yeah. And I think our community is asking for input before action rather than explanation of action. I'm concerned about adding a monthly meeting to our schedule. I'm not sure we could all handle that, but I don't see any problem of I like the idea of focus and the idea
we discussed were 2 board members, and it could be the same 2 each month or rotating, or I think if it's about facilities and they're on the facilities committee, they may be the 2 board members to go that month.
And it could be bi-monthly, you can do it a little. Bi-monthly would be more than we're doing now.
Right.
So
you just wanted to have a conversation about this today, right? So we're not coming to conclusions about it, but to get our heads thinking about this, I would just say, last comment from me is that this is about improving government approachability. I keep thinking of that Sims Deus thing, and people on high ruling over everybody. It irks me when I see that. I like card tables and stacking chairs, right? That works pretty good.
I don't like stacking chairs. It's okay if you want to stack the chairs.
These chairs stack.
Yeah,
I like Eileen's idea though too, just from that standpoint of to have kind of a broader range of topics, because people do, and sometimes we get bogged down in the a particular finance obviously being a cheap one right now and for good reason, but like one of the things that's come up at some point, drug and alcohol use in our district, and concerns people have with that. I hear that regularly in the community that we have issues with drug and alcohol use in our schools, but we don't have a lot of time to talk about that here. So
I got ideas
about drug and alcohol use.
Exactly. We've had conversations.
Well, why don't we let me do 2 clarification things. Why don't we come to the organizational meeting prepared to talk about a schedule of community meetings, and I'll prepare some sort of thing that can be the beginning of a discussion about that. But second, I would like some clarification as we move into talking about bylaws. Is there an interest in changing our public participation to something more like Jonathan suggested that other people do, a beginning and an ending, a beginning having to do with the agenda, the ending having to do with just general things, or not.
And I was not suggesting that.
I understand.
Proposing that.
I'm asking if there was an interest in that, or an interest in leaving public participation the way it is and helping that situation by thinking about community forums or town halls.
And let me just chime in on I have 2 competing dissatisfiers. And the first one is the idea of a community member taking their time and energy to come and say something, and then it just disappears into the ether. Thank you, we heard you. And the second one being the disruption of the meetings and the agenda and the flow when we try to incorporate those ideas into our current meeting. So there's two, competing dissatisfiers as far as I'm
You're saying if
concerned.
we separate it, you'd be concerned it would.
Well, I'm concerned because and to simplify, it wastes time. And I'm concerned because I want people's voices to be heard and them to feel like they're heard, not just we heard you.
So on the second part of that, again, I'm the major offender at this table, and good discussion.
Right.
I got it.
Yeah.
Good discussion. I think there is a more effective pathway forward. I will model that given the opportunity next year. And I would just simply say observationally, we rarely use the whole time allotment. We have rarely, I don't remember if we've ever used it all. So I don't think because of that necessarily that we need to have a two sessions in a meeting. I think we use them. Again, I'll try to be different in these things going forward and maybe figure out kind of, what would you call it, behavioral norms for that.
Do you mean to throw stuff at you?
And I'll try, and I will try, or whoever is in the center, whoever is in the center of the table will try to make sure there's some sort of statement that either says, we don't know how to answer that question now, but this is how it's going to get answered, or this is what it'll be.
That's the first part of Eric.
Yeah.
I didn't respond to that.
That's my bigger.
That needs to be answered.
Yeah.
My one comment too, and I agree, you weren't suggesting we do this. My one comment about putting the public participation at the end is sometimes we have very regular good meetings, but sometimes we get going for a long time discussing things or having reports. And I hesitate to put public participation at the end for two reasons. I don't think it's fair to put that to the end for those who are participating publicly. I don't think it's fair because I don't think we give the attention that we would give at the beginning of the meeting by the time we're at the end of the meeting on a Tuesday night at 10 o'clock. I don't think we attend as well to each other.
Especially the dogs have to get out.
Yes, I'll start bringing the dog to the meeting. It'll be okay. Be my support dog.
One thing I would I think we should consider adding policy wise. So it's a COVID thing that then we've gotten a couple times kind of tripping over ourselves. And what do we do with this? When someone has indicated a desire to have something read into they send us a letter and they'd like to have that read at the meeting. I think part of it, I think, again, is also honoring the people that take the time to actually show up. That should be the place for participation. We certainly can. I like what you do now with acknowledging that we've received communication, so people are hearing that. But it's been a little bit awkward a couple of times when someone said, "Hey," and we've said, "No, we might have done that back then, but we're not doing that anymore." If we simply say it in our policy,
It's a simple modification of the policy and somebody can come up with how many words, right?
Yeah.
But a recitation of a written communication can't exceed 3 minutes.
To do that, you'll need to be online.
What's the answer, sir? How many words is 3 minutes?
Well, that moves us right into the bylaws discussion because that policy is in our bylaws. And I did provide, and it is in board docs.
Sorry, I know that you wanted to move on and it is important to move on. Do we have anything else about the recordings in the minutes before we move on to that?
We can actually discuss that under bylaws.
Okay,
because
cool.
It's part of that.
Sounds
so
good.
That can come out there.
That's why you're in charge.
Yes. So I provided for the board, and it is in board docs. I went through all of the 0000 policies, and I gave some suggestions. Nothing that's on this sheet is anything that has been done. It is in board docs. If you can get to board docs, it is a document that is available there. Again, just this is in response to the notion of streamlining our policy somewhat. So what's under our bylaws are listed here, and I think there's a little less than 3 dozen of them. And we'll get to the major ones that I think we need to have a little discussion today before I make any changes. But Some of them are simply statement of law. For example, board powers and duties, board member authority. And I may, as a policy person, come back and say to the board, do we really need that in a policy that is stating the law? Do we want that as a statement on the board member website so people can find it easily and say, okay, here I know how this board got elected. Here I know what their authority is. Here I know what their duties are. There are several bylaws that I think need to be kept, and I've noted those on here. The major ones that I think we need to discuss are the Code of Ethics, Code of Conduct, and then the ones about meetings, minutes, broadcasting, recording, etc. So if you look first at, now I had one called up here. If you look at the Code of Conduct, and you do not need to spend a lot of time on it today, but the Code of Conduct, I believe, came from a long time ago. Probably a lot of the wording came from OSBA. Some of it has been doctored over the years specifically for the Loveland Board. I am concerned that it is, I don't know if you want to call it a little touchy-feely. It's got things like make every effort to attend all board meetings. Well, what's written into law is that a board can request the resignation of a board member if they consistently don't attend meetings. But there's nothing really in law that says you have to make every effort to attend every meeting. It's really not a document that I think is a policy. It's more of an agreement that we're going to follow these things. So I would like some guidance from the board if you would like to keep it, if you would like to refine it based on this particular Board of Education. And so again, we're not going to do that today, but I want to point it out to you. That to me is the most perhaps problematic of the policies that we have.
So I'm not going to comment on it today.
Okay.
I'm going to study it and I'll give you feedback.
Okay. All right. Is that all right with everybody? Take some time to
Sounds good to me.
study it and tell me what you think. Tell us what you think. Okay. The major ones are what Eric just suggested. I'm wondering if we can't, there are 6 policies about meetings and procedures. I'm wondering if it would not be a good idea to put everything into one policy about meetings. It explains what a regular meeting is, what a special meeting is, how we recess a meeting, how we go into executive session, how we vote, and how open meetings follow the Sunshine Law. To me, that would give us one place where people can look and find out about our meetings. Because it's a little misleading if you say, oh, I've read about meetings, but then, oh, wait, there's this other meeting
Applies
policy.
to this circumstance.
And so I would work on that. And obviously that would be something the board would look at and do. The minutes policy and the public participation and the broadcasting and recording of board meetings all go together. I heard a sense that we want to keep recording and broadcasting the way we are. There's a little bit of confusion because actually the broadcast and recording of board meetings was actually originally written for anyone recording the meeting who was not on the board. And I'm wondering if we don't somehow want to make it clear exactly what we're talking about and where we talk about broadcasting and recording meetings. I also was hoping we could enter into a very brief discussion. I think I got the section says that we are happy with the way things are going. I don't know if Adam's happy the way things are going, but we're trying to get this all refined. But there's a range of what a board can do. It is not required that we record video and stream and broadcast every meeting. That is not a requirement of the law. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying there's a range from having meetings and making sure that your minutes comply with the law without recordings and broadcastings, or having meetings that everything is recorded, everything is broadcast, and your minutes reflect that. Somewhere in the middle is a possibility, again, just a possibility. We could record and broadcast our regular business meetings. We could have a different procedure for our work sessions. This is a different procedure. We could have this meeting recorded, but not necessarily broadcast. We could have this meeting with extensive minutes. Again, I'm just asking if the policy should be cleaned up to reflect exactly what we do and how we do it. And that's why I asked about the public participation. Clean that up, make sure it's exactly how we do it. Talk about the not necessarily entering into the minutes, the recording. So those were the three, the minutes, public participation, broadcasting, and recording of board meetings.
Can I just
Throw
chime
it out
in?
on the table.
Just one more thing to throw out on the table that goes with that is, what is our retention of records policy and how does that apply to these meetings over time?
Yes,
Is our retention of records is not indefinite.
that's correct.
And this is a record.
If I recall correctly, and the last time I went over it minutely was with our treasurer, Kevin Hawley, there's a different records retention for minutes, which I believe are kept in perpetuity, actually kept in a paper book.
Right. I remember
And
reading
if
that.
the law still says they have to be. So what we do and what is published for board docs has to be transferred to a paper book. The law still says we have to have that paper book. So those are forever and always. But there is a different procedure for recordings, tapes, that kind of, and they do not have to be kept in perpetuity. There's an amount of time. And I'm sorry, I don't remember what it is.
And that's
hazard a guess.
perfectly okay. But like to one degree, like, and we've had these conversations fairly extensively. I feel comfortable that our minutes in the written form meet the requirements of the law. I think they're far from adequate in describing exactly what happened in the meeting, which I believe is impossible to reflect in written minutes. So if we have a book of written minutes that then refers to the videos that we have with the timestamps of the discussions that no longer exist, that concerns me.
Say that last part again.
If we have a paper book of minutes that's filled with references to videos and timestamps that have been discarded.
So our records retention policy or procedure can be changed to reflect what the board wants. It cannot be made less than what the Records Retention Commission at the state level says we have to have, but it could be made longer. We could decide if tapes only need to be kept for 5 years. We could change that and say they need to be kept forever, or as long as the machines exist.
Well, and then there's
changes.
the problem, to go back, like in my perfect world, I'd say we need to keep these records forever, but we have them on Betamax tapes that you no longer can look at. So how do you then encumber somebody in the future to keep up with the technology that you've had from the past?
The other problem is, what do you do when you have your board office at the bottom of a hill downtown and you have 2 floods that come in and destroy half your records? I don't believe we lost any minutes that way, but we did lose quite a few paper records that way at one point. So, and even some digital records, because the materials they were kept on.
We wouldn't be alone. I said we wouldn't be alone. There's a big VA fire, I think, in St. Louis. There's a lot of veterans records that you just can't get. So, I mean, stuff happens that you can't, entirely mitigate. But I do think, I don't know, a couple of comments. One is on the minutes. I like the minutes that we have. I think that they are pretty good answer to both the state requirements and the public's needs. Do they give you a printed full discussion of what was talked about? No, and I don't know how to do that, because I think that I, for one, would not approve records that didn't get it down to the nth degree of what I said, right? And we'll never come to agreement about a written recap that is very detailed. So having the video as a complement to that, I've always thought is the best of all worlds. I do think that there's something that from a technology perspective that we need to take care of, and that's I think it's still pretty much YouTube, and I'm continue to be uncomfortable that Google really owns all of that. Someday I worry that Google decides we need to make more money because,
Right.
Advertising isn't doing so well. So all of a sudden we're going to start to charge for all this stuff, or we're going to put a limit on how much you can have and whatever. I do think we need to have some control over the records that are stored in those places.
I don't want to interrupt you too much, but do we have backup copies that are non-Google YouTube copies living in our servers?
So all these meetings back up to Zoom's cloud. And
Okay.
then we also download those too. So we have those as well.
Okay.
So we're okay.
I was going to say Zoom Cloud. I'm like, wait. but if we don't.
The Google account in education versus non-education is different in that Google states that you own, in theory, you own all the data that is linked to those accounts. So since you're using that Google account to upload that to YouTube, technically it's still in possession. But
Well,
I know
leave it
that
up
gets
to
a little-
you and the lawyers to make sure that our rights are protected
Yep.
in, essentially perpetuity,
Absolutely.
and that we've got control over these digital assets.
To speak a little bit about the minutes, I do think that Mr. Giuffre has been candid about the fact that he's been trying to make sure that more discussion gets added in
Right.
resolutions and votes. I'm not sure we're quite at the exact point yet, but the only way to get the exact minutes on paper is, I know that the city of Loveland, for example, does a tape recording, and they have a transcriber who I believe still does this, transcribes everything. So they have a court recorder transcription of their meeting. And I do know that leads to some discussion when minutes are approved, someone saying, I didn't say that, or I didn't say it that way. It requires that board members then review everything to make sure that it is what they said, and it is cumbersome. And again, what we would have to do is take that whole thing. It would make our minutes book
Right.
quite a bit fatter, and they're big, heavy things anyway.
I'm sure that's not a free service.
Oh, no,
As
no.
well,
there's a cost
so
to
that would
I
be
mean, you
a
have to
cost
have
where-
a person at the meeting and a transcriber. And that's why the time stamping, I think, works well. But that means, anyway, again, it was just a question as I begin to bring these bylaws back to you for approval. What should be a proposed cleanup and what should be left exactly the way it is.
Interesting to see what other districts are doing, because this is a fairly new issue. I would assume they're not putting it all on microfiche. So figuring out what other districts are doing.
You mean as far as minutes are concerned?
How long are we keeping them? Because
Okay.
you always say you don't need anything until it's gone, and then you need it. And I've had to refer to some older board meetings, minutes, just to kind of read through and see what happened. It's on board docs. I guess that'd be another question. I wonder if it could live in board docs.
Uploaded to board docs.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
look into that. That's a good question.
Well, we really have, there's a time frame, a year when we started keeping them on board docs, right? But there's a digital record of all of our minutes there.
I'm saying if you could
Right.
put the video right on board docs
Oh, I see.
and just have it
Is that
live
just a
there.
link?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. As far as I know, I have not looked into the recordings and where they're available. I have looked at a great variety of minutes of boards across the state, and I think that we are very much in line, but also quite a bit better than some in some aspects. I do not know how many districts are videotaping and broadcasting their meetings. I don't think there is a great number of them. I don't believe that.
I know, because and this was a very non-scientific sample, but I just sampled a bunch of small and large districts, and I didn't find when we started doing it that anyone was preserving them.
Right.
So we're definitely on the leading edge of that as far as the transparency of what we've done in a meeting and why we've done it.
Right.
I know some districts are housing or have them on YouTube. I just
Right.
don't know where else they're housing them and for how long.
And I'm sure that people are starting to catch up to us, because I did that when we had the initial, I think in this room, as a matter of fact, about the one of the problems with having a video was having the ADA requirement that it could be subtitled.
Right.
And then how were we going to subtitle the videos?
Right.
And at that point in time, I couldn't find anybody else who was doing that.
Right.
And to go back, I also did the same with meetings minutes, and we're well within the normal range of meetings minutes for school boards.
I do think that the YouTube closed captioning has gotten pretty good.
Yeah, I was gonna say that works
It
pretty
still
well.
has a problem with switching.
I know.
So that's okay.
That's entertainment.
But so does everybody.
Okay, anything else that you can think of on this list?
Well, I just would
I'll
add,
come back to you.
yeah, well, I would just add that I'd like to make sure that we have a conversation about how do we make sure that our records retention policy interacts with our or with our minutes policy.
Good
Okay.
point. Yeah, good call out.
I will check on that. All right. Then we are at, unless there's other discussion that you want to happen under that calendar, board officers, board appointees, meeting processes and bylaws.
So can I ask clarification? So we're discussing this, you're looking into a few things. And then at our next meeting, we will, as a group, decide, yes, this is how we want to do it. Because I don't feel like we've come to any, I know that we're not coming to resolutions on things, but I still feel like we're all over the place.
Right.
With
Calendar will come January 10th. The calendar will be definitely have to be approved. Board officers, committees will be approved then. Planning and zoning appointee will be then. I will bring at least some of the bylaws back on January 10th, those particularly pertaining to board meetings, public participation, minutes. So those will come back. I had asked that someone come back with a suggestion for community meetings. I don't feel comfortable always being the one who says, let's do this. So I'm asking that board members be prepared to discuss what they would like to do as far as community or town hall meetings are concerned. So we will discuss that January 10th. I'm not sure that I will have all of these bylaws ready for January 10th, but they will be coming at another meeting for approval.
But once
Does that cover everything?
once we add a second member to the policy committee, we'll be able to just tear right through them.
That's gonna be it.
Right here? Okay. I know that Kevin, would everybody like
I was gonna
a
say.
short 10-minute break, and then we will come back and talk about finances? Coffee, donuts, kind bars, water over here, coffee, donuts. I know I'm not talking to you much, but I know you're back there. So our minutes should say, I'm sorry, we're taking a break then.
Oh, okay. Good time. Because this is going to go for a while.
9:30.
but we are getting ready to enter into the final discussion topic of our meeting, which will be to talk about district finances. So everybody take your policy and your procedure hat off and put on your finance hat. And again, we'll wait a second for Eileen. I don't know what process we haven't orchestrated any process for this. Don't know if we have a sense of maybe hearing a report from superintendent first, or how we will work on this. But it is, again, just a discussion.
Do you want to cover the attachment that's in 3.1? Is that something that we were planning to talk about, or is that just informational?
I believe the attachment in 3.1 is just the election deadline memo, and that I briefly discussed. We can certainly look at it if you'd like to.
I just wanted to make sure that the dates that we had set up projected for our meetings matched with those.
Yeah, I checked. That was the document I used to check, and I will reconfirm that as I bring the dates forward for January 10th.
Because I read the 120, 100, 98, and 90-day deadlines, and I was like, what?
What? Yes, it's a document put out by the Auditor of State, I believe, and it gives you on Board of Elections, and it gives you a variety of dates for a variety of different issues.
And it seemed like ours mostly fall under the 90-day deadline.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
The other date constraint that we have is that there are two actions to have something be on a ballot. And so we need an action to ask for a certification of an amount, or you can ask for a certification of different amounts. And then there needs to be enough time for the county auditor to certify that. In order for the major date is the date to place something on the ballot. You need to have that certification done before you place something on the ballot. So that main date that we're looking at is that end date, that it has to be on the ballot, has to be done
to
prior
get on the
to
ballot.
putting on the ballot.
Great.
So, okay, so maybe we'll ask Mr. Broadwater to give us a little update.
Sure. Adam's got it popped up there. I'll let the board know the day after the election, we did go around and talk to every staff. We got the staffs together. It's a difficult conversation. And I know we talk a lot about things that are on pieces of papers and on TV, but when you have these conversations with people, they can be pretty difficult. And the staff, yes.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
We have a note up there that someone has raised their hand. I don't know if that's a audience member.
Looks like it is.
I wonder if we could ask that audience member, can they put something in the chat if they have a question or if they're having trouble hearing? If we can just find out.
I think as an audience member, they can only raise their hand to be able to talk. I don't think it allows them to type.
Doesn't allow them to chat.
So, James, if you're listening to this, just send us a text on Zoom, or
They won't be able to send it through Zoom.
I'll tell you what,
Email
send an
if
email
there's
to
an issue.
board@lovelandschools.org. And if it's something that we can help you with today, we'll try to do that. Otherwise, we'll find a way to respond separately.
And then just, I know the answer to this, but our recording is in the top right. Is the slide presentation is also being shown?
Yes, correct.
Great. Sorry, go ahead.
Very good.
Sorry.
No problem.
People could hear.
Just raise your hand if you have any questions. So the conversation has been very good. Our staff, we have a great staff, and our kids are awesome. The presentation I put together really is the same. My information is not going to change. There's still a need for additional revenue. How we adjust to the failing of a levy, I will cover with my last slide, but the first few slides are really from the June 16th presentation, which I've got up there. So the first slide that I put on was how are the funds going to be used? And we said, obviously, to maintain, just keep doing what we're doing. The high school busing and then the 5 FTEs. So B and C obviously is up for discussion and how we want to move forward with high school busing and any additional staffing now is off the table. For now when we look at that. But I will tell the board kind of what we were saying with the difficult conversations with staff and kids. I've got a meeting set up next week with, I want to say it's 5 or 6 families, the non-English speaking families that are struggling to get their kids to school. And we're going to try and find some alternative ways to get them there. I've got one parent who's been paying Uber both ways to get their kid to school. And so we're going to try and figure out how we can, fund that for them and take care of that. But these conversations, again, words on a piece of paper are easy to read and easy to say. Having these conversations are pretty difficult. The next slide that I've got up there is just to reiterate and maybe clarify some things. What if we wait till later was what I presented in June? This would be the same scenario as if we're waiting later now because the levy hasn't passed, right? And so we said significant reductions will need to be made in order for us to balance our budget. Expenditures are going to be reviewed. And unfortunately, some of these decisions are going to have a critical impact. When I look at the last slide I have up here, we'll go through some of the adjustments that we're going to make. The confusion, I was thinking when you were talking about town halls, I think people really get confused on how levy campaigns even work. I think they think that we can do a lot more than we can actually do. And a couple of examples. Number one, I had somebody call me and ask, why did the district pay money to rent out the Oasis when I presented at the Oasis? And we can't do that. The district cannot do that. It was a community group that asked me to come in and speak and just give information. And that's the extent of the participation I can have. And so I think there's a lot of confusion because it's confusing on how they work. But along with that, the Loveland Supports Loveland PAC, which was really running the campaign, they would ask me to come and speak here and there, or anybody could ask me to come and speak here and there. They put out a postcard where I believe it said 50 staff reductions. It's just important to clarify that there's been no district communication that said that. That was coming out of the PAC and all hardworking, good people. But I wanted to make sure I clarified this is the communication that the district has given when it comes to reductions. And I'll look at it a little bit later too. Go ahead, hit the next one.
Sorry, Mike,
yeah,
just to reiterate the point that you just made, and we all know this, but I know that there was a lot of confusion about it. None of the signs were paid for. No consultants were hired. Nothing. The school district did nothing as far as specifically spending money to pass a levy.
Right. Yeah, I think it's confusing. Somebody also called and said, when I was going out to the houses, to the driveways and all that in the evening, they had heard I was receiving donations for coming out and doing that. And it's just not a part of what we do. We do it so that we can try and inform people of what we do for kids. So there's a lot of, it's tough because the campaign rules are difficult. So this is just a quick review for the board of the levies that have passed. 2014 is the last one. So we're going to be entering 9 years without additional revenue, close to a decade without additional revenue. The effective millage is down into the 30s. A quick reminder is December of 23 is when 1 mil is going to drop off. I bring that up now because if the board is deciding on a levy this May or this November, whenever it would be, additional funds would not show up until 24, which means that mill would be dropped off that tax bill before it's assessed, if that makes sense.
And that's a bond mill that will drop off.
Right. And it's not, apples to apples in terms of the value, but it will be dropping off in December of 23. So that,
Mike, just so I'm clear about it, December, the end of next year, the end of calendar next year,
yes,
is when taxpayers would see a reduction in their tax bill of that mill.
I don't know if it would be January.
January 24.
January 24 is when they would actually see the cash impact.
Right.
Because I know the actual date changes depending on how the repayment schedule is going. So.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Next slide, Evan. So one of the slides from June was, what have we done to manage our budget? And I hear this all the time. And so I just want to reiterate what we have done. This past year, we saved about $600,000 on the way that we did hire. Maintaining FTE counts, as you know, our Director of Human Resources, Garth Collier, we've got him keeping track of our FTEs, and I'll show you a little example of that. And the reason FTEs is it's people. I hate to keep saying FTEs, it's staff. And so the reason we look at that 5 to 90% of our budget, that's where all of these cost cutting measures are going to happen. And so the contract, the teachers took a 0 and a 0. There were steps, but on the base, it was 0% and 0%. ESSER funds, we are still using strategically, which means we are not, some districts use them as bonuses, and to add things, we basically supplanted a lot of salaries, and that's going away at the end of next year. And I'll review the FTEs we're using there in a minute. Alternative funding, we have tuition for kindergarten, and it does pay for itself. We're looking into grants and business partnerships, which was part of the strategic vision. Pay to participate, the fees, we're going to have to look at. We're going to have to look at and see what exactly needs to be done there with the failure of the levy. So what I wanted to make sure I reiterate with the board and the community, that in May of 2020, there were 551.7 FTEs, staff people. There is no 0.7 person. It's just how much they work. So you had 551.7. In November of 2021, we were down to 504.5. You'll see it fluctuate month to month, basically probably because of bus drivers or food service workers, not teachers or administrators. So part A there, 8.5% of the total staff was reduced with the 47.2 FTE reduction. 17.5 were transportation, with your high school busing being cut. 17 was the teaching staff. And what I would say with the teaching staff there, I also heard a lot about, well, enrollment's down 200 or 300 kiddos. Why do you need the same amount of staff? And the answer is we don't. That's why the 17 FTEs, our class sizes, while our class sizes are still the second highest in Hamilton County, we're still getting it done in the classroom. But that was the adjustment for the enrollment that worked out. And then 4 FTEs in administration were cut. Then the next slide I mentioned, I hope you can see this. This is the chart that I've had our Human Resources Director, Garth, taking a look at every month. And we said we would present to the board every month. In November of 22, it's probably hard to see back there, but FTEs were at 495.7. So that's further down from where we were November of 2021. A lot of that is on the classified side, finding custodians, food service, bus drivers, but then also a few other FTEs. When you look at the gray, and I'm just looking at November of 2022, when you look at the gray, 7.5 staff members, we are using the ESSER funds to pay for. And those 7.5, you have 2.5 teachers. That's reading intervention specialists because of the COVID gap. And if you read any studies, they're saying that there are some issues with the COVID gap and reading. The 5 paraprofessionals was to support the reading specialists, as well as special ed needs have gone up. We've seen some behaviors where kids don't really know how to play school because they've been out of school. So those 7.5 FTE that are paid through ESSER, we have ESSER through next year. Once ESSER is gone, those are gone. And so that would be a reduction 7.5, not out of the general fund because we're using ESSER, but that support staff for our kids, that certainly will be gone once ESSER is gone.
Mike, just to be clear about that,
Sure.
Those 7 FTEs, you're saying, given the current situation, will exit the building.
Correct.
You heard anything, Mike, statewide? The state's still sitting on a significant surplus of dollars from federal COVID relief. Is there advocacy going on, particularly knowing that, we've got reading issues in schools? Is there any advocacy going on to continue to provide some funds to supplement that for districts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going through all meetings that I've attended the last few weeks, I have not heard any of that. One thing that reminds me of, it's not really pertaining to this. I had quite a few questions. I think Cincinnati.com put out the safety grants, and because we did not receive it, people assumed we didn't apply. We applied, we just didn't get it. And
That round.
that round, yeah. So the first round we applied, we did receive eventually. That was $100,000. We're working on that. The second round we applied, we did not receive. And so people were confused when Loveland wasn't on the list. They assumed we didn't apply. We did apply. We just didn't receive that second round of safety grants.
There were a lot of first rounders that didn't get money in the second round. I think that was part of the process, not exclusively, but part of the process, right?
Right. Yeah. It just reminded me when you asked, there is some money there that the state has that I've not heard about.
Can I just, two quick things.
Sure.
First of all, I want to be clear, want to make sure I'm understanding. The 7.5 that's in the gray line, those are purely positions that are 1-year positions that could be not continued when we don't have ESSER funds. Those paraprofessionals have nothing to do with the paraprofessionals that are needed or required in special education. So there are some things that happen in the paraprofessional line that we cannot necessarily budget for or necessarily control. They are required when we have certain students that require them.
Correct. Good
So
point.
that's a place where we might see some change, needed change, desired change, but something that we don't necessarily budget for or plan for.
Yeah. And so, for example, we provided an update to the board this week, I believe. Preschool, the way it works, we've got kiddos coming in January. They'll start at the beginning of the year. We have at least 2 kiddos that we have had meetings with that we're going to be required to have a 1-to-1 pair. So that's 2 FTEs, if you want to look at it that way, but it's going to be 2 adults that need to be with those kiddos. That would not be listed under ESSER. ESSER has strict guidelines in terms of how you can use their funds. And so we try and supplant salaries with the ESSER as much as we can so we don't touch the general fund. But there are sometimes you can't do that. Yeah.
And for those 2 that are coming in, there's no one in the current paraprofessional line that could be moved over.
No.
Okay.
No, every pair that we have. So up there, we have 77.6. They're all in classrooms and attached to our IEP special ed kids.
Do we get additional funds coming in with the students who require one-on-one?
We will get some funding for the pairs. It's not going to fully fund everything, but you do get, I don't know what title it is, Title I or Title II. You do get some funding for it. It doesn't cover all of it.
So this is an example, Mike, of we've gone back and forth, and I'll talk more about it later, but we've gone back and forth about contingency fund, the line. This is the kind of thing that the contingency would have been allocated to. And in lieu of the contingency, we're just going to take it in the budget. And it's going to be a negative variance. It is what it is, right? Right.
Yeah, it's that's the hard part when you say do the budget. The budget's hard without that contingency line. Now you're adjusting because and those I said paraprofessionals, they're actually nurses. It's going to be those kiddos need their individual nurse. So we'll have 2 nurses, which that's tough to find. So we're already looking for that. But if there isn't the contingency line, then you're adjusting. Something's got to come out, so something can go in.
But it's, again, I know we had a lot of questions about what is a contingency for. We now have 2 examples of it. Last month, we talked about transportation for homeless kids that exceeds our capacity. So there's incremental dollars there. Now we have to hire 2 nurses for special needs, desperately special needs kids, I guess. And that's, some part of that is going to be on our books.
Right.
And these are things that are required by law for.
Yeah. Right.
Well, and this goes back to my question. So I have 2. One is, just to be clear, what is our requirements for law providing services down to the preschool level?
Good question. Preschool, if they are special ed, we're required to provide for that. If they're not special ed, not necessarily. But if they are special education children in our community, then yes, we do have to provide that.
Starting at age 3.
Three, I believe.
Right. So there's no way around those expenses. You can't say, hey, get rid of your preschool program, or hey, shut down kindergarten. We still have those expenses.
This is the thing that I think lots of people, I mean, we were special needs recipients, so our family knows a little bit about this. But even with that experience, there's lots that we didn't know. Essentially the public schools have this responsibility to care for these kids, where I think generally speaking, the parochial schools don't go here, because there is a public school obligation under law to do it. And I think a lot of moral obligation as well. But this is part of what we do.
And to reflect back to that, the way that our current funding model is set up, it's reflected back to the community of Loveland to pay for that.
Right, exactly.
I think
It's part of what the community pays for. That isn't always seen.
right. All these stories on paper are pretty easy. These are pretty difficult stories for these two young children. But the other part that it's hard to put a number on is when you're able to educate kids a little bit earlier down the road, that obviously pays off. And so the reading interventions, maybe they don't need as many in second grade or third grade because we've been able to get them caught up. And so that's the point. It's hard to equate that and put a dollar on it.
And the research is that's significant too.
Well, and I'll be the contralateral card. I'm very skeptical that a preschooler who needs a full-time nurse is getting anything other than socialization. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter.
I just in general, yeah.
It's kind of a desperate situation if you're there.
I'm with you. I mean, but for the grace of God, yeah. But again, it's a burden that's placed somewhat unfairly on the public school system.
Right, and something that was misunderstood earlier on, that there was conversation about, not only is it a requirement for public education to do this, it's a requirement for public education to advertise and look for these children. There was a question asked, why are we recruiting students? But there is actually a legal requirement to make sure that people in Loveland know that they are entitled to these services. So we need to find them and serve them.
So I'm not sure. I haven't done all my research on this one, but it might be, we'll probably have some handle on the percentage of IEPs in our enrollment. I think it's in the 15 to
20%.
The first time I saw that, I was really, I don't know though how it compares with other districts, but it's, there's a fairly sizable percentage of our population, of our enrollment that gets special services in one sense right out of it.
When you talk about there's a lot of things that kind of come up from a state that you're not really prepared for when it comes to funding and requirements. Last year, the conversation was with every preschool classroom, which you're required to provide services for the special ed kids in our district that are going to preschool. With every preschool classroom, there had to be your preschool certified teacher, but also a special education teacher and a paraprofessional. So that special education teacher, if that would have went through, that would have been about 4 to 5 additional special ed teachers for preschool. And so last year, as Jesse Coles and I discussed it, I'm like, I don't have the funding for that. I can't do that. And so we did discuss things with ODE. Other districts were having the same issue, so they put it off. But that's something you never know when that comes back. And now you've got 4 or 5 FTEs that you haven't budgeted for.
This is not a question that I'm asking because I don't think anyone knows the answer, but there's a bill that passed in the Senate changing the structure of the Ohio Department of Ed.
Yeah.
I believe there's a sense that it may not be taken up or considered in the House, but we don't know that yet. And so at some point, this board would need to think about how that would change or how that could impact things that we do as well, because it would, as the Senate bill structured it, it would reduce the Ohio Department of Education to teacher licensure and accreditation and
Right.
maybe one other thing, and the rest would come under a department that's under the government's purview.
Yeah, it's House Bill
The
1.
governor's purview.
Yeah, Governor, House Bill 178 is what you're referring to, and it would come under the governor's purview. And really, ODE would be relegated to teacher licensure, which really is done at the local level anyhow, for the most part. But
So Mike, before you move,
Sure, go ahead. Let me get a question first. So just to go back, these ESSER funds, the 7.5 in November 22, we have those funded completely through ESSER through the end of this school year or through the end of 2023?
next school year through the end, so
Through the end
the
of
funds.
The 23-24 school year.
Correct. Yes.
so actually building off of that,
Okay.
we're in the same spot, but you're going to see it in a little while here, but I've done a lot of work on historical and future expenditure revenues, et cetera. And one of the issues is making sure that ESSER is properly accounted for
Yes.
in there.
Yep.
And correct me if I'm wrong about this, because I think I'm right, but I'm reading here that there are two really different kinds of ESSER situations. There are employees whose salaries are being covered by ESSER today, that ESSER will go away and those people will still be here. And therefore, we will see a growth in general fund because today they're being paid for by ESSER. There's some of those. And then what we're seeing in the ESSER column here, these people are being paid for by ESSER. When ESSER goes away, these people are going away. That won't change the general fund picture at all, right? Because they're not in the general fund to begin with, and they're not going to be in it tomorrow. So these eliminations will not appear.
Right.
The only place that we'll really realize it is in this chart.
So your first example, I don't know if I don't think we have any employees in that. We did when we first got the
Yeah, the ones
ESSER
I'm
funds.
thinking about are, I'll double check when we get to it, but I think it's 21 and 22 that we had it.
Right.
Maybe 20 and 20.
And it was a total of $2.2 million that was offset. So
That's right. That's right.
And so they don't help or hurt us in terms of our operating budget because they're
Well,
outside of it right
This is
now.
one of the problems with kind of school finance.
Right.
When you look at a number, what does that number actually represent? Right. And it's kind of sometimes pretty precise. In this case, ESSER allowed us to take some employees, I don't know what the rules were, but some employees and charge them against ESSER funds. They came out of the general fund, which is the number that we all always look at, and they came down to a separate fund. We have probably, we probably have 75 different funds. And ESSER is just another one way down there. So these people came down and they're charged against the ESSER line. It looked like our expenses came down. Well, our general fund expenses came down is technically the answer. When these people are no longer funded by ESSER, they come back up to the general line. So it's part of the reason you see this,
and then,
higher than historic growth rate for a period of time.
And I say to piggyback, and then you get questions about why did your growth rate go up so much in 22?
And this is part of it, and I'll try to cover that. It's not the whole story, but it's, to Mike's point, it's a couple $1 million worth of expenses that look like all of a sudden showed up out of nowhere. Well, in fact, what happened is that ESSER ran out. We couldn't offset the expenses anymore.
You're saying that's still going to be true in 2 years, or you're saying that was true and now, but I thought I
think
was hearing.
What I'm understanding is that deal is largely behind us.
Right.
So this deal is a little different because this continues on
Yeah.
for a little longer.
But then
But
it
it
goes
doesn't
away.
matter.
Goes away.
It's not
That's
affecting
right.
the general fund because these FTEs are going to
That's what I
disappear.
was saying. Yeah.
It's good that we have them.
But
That's
it's
why
great
you're
that we
in
have
gray.
But it does to our overall operating budget.
So it's a little confusing. I'll get into that later on when Mike's done, but
One quick question. Back to the preschool piece. I imagine we're not eligible for them because we are a public district, but there were a number of state dollars grants available to preschools specifically. So we got a couple of really good grants in the last 2 years for our preschool. I don't know if those are available, for application as well, but
Yeah, I'll
There's
check with
significant.
Jesse and see where we are. I don't know that off the top of my head.
And there's one more, and Jesse and I have had this conversation in the past. Do we have the ability, especially when we bring in nurses, to charge the health insurance of the individuals?
Say again.
So when nursing care is brought in, there's the ability, I believe, that we can also recoup some of the expenses through the health insurance of the child.
Individual.
I'm not 100% sure of that, but we
Okay.
talked
Let me
about
stop
that.
taking
Probably talk about Medicaid, I would think.
Yeah, right. Because they're almost always Medicaid.
Yeah, because the bills are so enormous.
Yeah, I'll check. We all set with that? The next slide, and I'll get through these. Again, you've seen all these before. Kind of the point I wanted to make with this, we keep saying that the large part of our budget is salary and benefits, and we all understand that. But when you look at purchase services, supplies, and other, that if you add those up, that gives you about $7.2 million. So that's $7.2 million. I wouldn't even say they're discretionary funds, because the purchase services, that's going to be your special ed services through Hamilton County and different things like that. So as we go through there, we start talking about, well, what budget cuts are we going to make? With everything outside of salary and benefits, if we're looking at $7 or $8 million, even if we cut 10% of what we have there, it's still only $700,000 or $800,000, and the deficit we're looking at is over $3 million. And so it's going to people will say get the scissors out and start cutting, and that's what we're going to have to do. But there's not much left to cut when you talk about purchase services, supplies, and other. The other point, the expenditures at $51.1 million. I've gotten some emails from community members that I don't think I've done a very good job of explaining it, and maybe I can figure out how to do it, but they will see expenditures at $51.1 million and say, why doesn't that have to go higher? Why can't you live within your means and keep it at $51 million forever and ever and ever? And I haven't found a way to explain that very well, but when you look at purchase services, supplies, and other, there's just not much there in terms of savings. It's going to be salaries and benefits. And so you have one of two choices, which is what we put in the newsletter, outside of alternative funding. But salaries of employees are going to get cost of living adjustment. That's what happens. The last 2 years, the teachers, like we said, took 0 and 0, but had the steps. But when you look at the industry standard and what other districts do, what other employers do outside of education, there are cost of living adjustments. So when we say, why don't we just make some cuts so that we can stay at the $51 million, the example I would give is we just cut 47 FTEs and we're still here. So one cost of living adjustment might mean 20 employees are reduced, and then the next year it's 20 more employees. And then so at some point you need additional revenue. If you look at any school district in the state of Ohio, their expenditures are going to go up, and it's going to go up probably based on their staff contracts. Because when you look at the purchase service, supplies, and other, again, there's just not a whole lot of meat on the bone there. So I haven't found a good way to explain it other than
Mike, let me just, sorry to throw one out at you. And we know this very well. Our purchase services and our supplies aren't staying flat. They're going up with inflation.
Correct.
And we were hit with a significant inflationary bill for purchase services for special education students that we didn't have any ability to say no to.
They work in, that's Hamilton
Right.
County Educational Service Center, worked in a 5% increase. You're probably going to see that every year. It'll be 5% every year.
So when you say just, tighten your belt, well, we are legally required to do this. We have to provide supplies.
Right.
And I don't know if that helps you to explain it to people, but a significant chunk, even if you could tell your staff, we are never giving you a raise again, which is a great way never to get a new teacher to come to the level.
Right.
You still would have an increase in your budget.
Right.
So I know you and I are extremely aware of this, and I assume that everybody else at the table is aware of it, but the community isn't always aware of what happens when you have collective bargaining agreements. In other words, when you have unions. And the fact of the matter, and this is, it's amply covered by both state and federal law. Think of a contract with the employee. We have signed a contract that says there's a rate of pay, there's a rate of increases, there's working conditions, there's a long list of things. And we've sat down and signed a legally binding contract. You don't get to walk away from that. On top of that, when it expires, I'm afraid some people think, I'm a little partial to Reagan firing the controllers a million years ago, but being a pilot, I understand that didn't actually work out so well. It really didn't. It had safety issues associated with it because it's a highly trained environment, and all of a sudden we're going to find all these highly trained people to do this work. But well beyond that, law has evolved over the years, and there are a whole range of protections over the process where the practical ability to dictate terms is really, I won't say it's impossible, but it's remote. So what you really have is a negotiation process, and that is voluntary by both sides until it isn't. And then when it isn't and things break down, things get ugly in a hurry. And I bet most people in town haven't been through strikes. I've been through a bunch of them. And I would tell you, sometimes there are means to an end, but there are pretty ugly means to an end, and you don't always anticipate the dynamics of it. So it's a very complicated environment, is what I'm trying to say here.
There's two parts of it that are even more complicated that you haven't brought up, which is the more hostile you make a working environment, the less likely you are to have people want to enter that environment.
Right.
So if the reputation of Loveland is, they go on strike, and every time you go to the teacher's contract, they go down to the mat and they don't give them any raises at all.
Right.
Where else should I look to teach? And as we've seen, we always have turnover in teachers. You'll always need to bring teachers in.
Right.
And we don't have a limitless supply of teachers in the bag, just, waiting to fill these jobs, especially in today's environment.
Sometimes I'm afraid the teachers get, talked about as a word,
right?
Not as human beings. The teachers this, where the teacher's at, but
any staff,
And the fact is that these are our employees. These are the people that do what it is we are supposed to get done. So if you create the kind of hostile environment that you described, you just think about those teachers walking into the classroom tomorrow, and how are they going to feel? I mean, they're human beings. How are they going to feel? How are they going to do their jobs, et cetera? So if you're interested in accomplishing the mission of having a great learning environment and launching these kids into their future, you want to enable that with talent that is invested and motivated to go get the job done, right? So there's a very difficult balancing process of working with the union, and ending up with a result that works financially for the district and works well enough for the employees so that we can get the job done tomorrow. So I have more of this experience than probably most people, but it's easy to minimize this issue. It's very difficult to fundamentally change it. And, we were, I think, very successful last time around in achieving cooperation between the parties to make progress. I don't know what this year will look like. And I'll talk about it again in a little while, but it is an unknown because we have contracts coming up this year.
And even then, you guys were able to get to that outcome, but there was a point in time where it was challenging, right?
It took a year.
And, we hit that summer, and it's like, okay, we gotta get there.
Nobody knew what was going on.
Yeah.
But it took a year of very hard conversations to achieve a result. I'll just, whatever it is, right? And I always joke about the fact that, in my old union worlds, when everybody was unhappy, you knew you probably were at the limits. Nobody really wanted this, but it's as far as you could get it. And that was compromise at that point. The days of big wins, you just don't find them anymore. It's just a very difficult process. Nobody's really happy about the outcome, but hopefully both sides achieve a little bit of what they're after.
And to go back, we continually have the opportunity to revisit that, and we will again this spring.
Right.
It's a tough conversation. Leading a staff, we had it's not a coincidence that you have a perfect report card and your school district is doing very, very well, and you have veteran staff. I hate to say it, but this is my 5th decade in education. I started in the 80s. If you ask young Mike at 21 years old versus me, I think I've got a lot more knowledge, a lot more experience. Doesn't mean I'm any smarter. I just know how things work. And so sometimes it's easy to cast that aside and say, we just want the cheapest one. It doesn't work that way. If you walk into a classroom of 26 second graders and that door shuts and it's you versus 26 second graders, have fun when you're 21. When you've got some experience, it just, you start to figure that out. So
of the 12 perfect scoring districts in the state, 600, whatever, of the 12, I believe 4, including us, have very highly tenured teachers, either at our level or higher. There were 3 that had less tenured teachers than we do. So it's a piece of evidence that suggests support for what Mike is saying. Maybe not 100% perfect, but it's interesting.
Just next slide, Adam. I just put on there, I hear about participation fees. I kind of mentioned it. I wanted to reiterate this slide, which does show our parents are paying the highest participation fees in Hamilton County, along with all of these other schools. We do not give families any adjustment if they have more than one athlete. They're paying the same amount, $310 at the high school and $265 at the middle school. So looking at participation fees, we already are getting quite a bit. I know the Planning Commission, if you look online, I think it's still there. The extracurricular fees are there. And so I just wanted to reiterate that we will look at it, but we are pretty high right now. So the last page I put on there, I got one more. We started talking about, we don't like to get into this conversation, and we could maybe talk about it a little bit later. I know Mr. Dufresne is going to evaluate it as well, but at some point with Loveland City Schools, if there's not additional revenue, we know what happens, right? The state of Ohio comes in and says, hey, you got a problem. We are evaluating right now. The belief might be that we've entered fiscal caution, but we want to make sure that we are where we say we are. So I don't want to say that as gospel. It's just, we're going to look into it and see where we're going. Mr. Doherty, I know, has been pushing to see what that means and how we're going to do. And even the 5-year forecast, what's that mean? And there's some assumptions in there that we have to take a look at. But I can tell you we're one step closer, and it's not a comfortable step to take. And but we'll evaluate it so we can let the community know what that means here pretty soon. And then the last slide. Basically, the day after the levy did not pass, I sat down and looked at what are we going to do. It's basically going to be with Gard Collier because it's people, right? That's where we're going to save some money. So there's going to be a hiring freeze for any additional positions. I wanted to make sure I put the caveat in there. Special education requirements like these 2 nurses, we can't do anything about. The staff reductions via retirements and or resignations, we've already got a list. We're going to look at that, not replacing those. And I can tell you right now, the list that I have, when you don't replace those employees, we're getting into programming pretty deep. It's going to be programming for kids and what educational opportunities they have. So we've got a list of that we will move forward with. The cash balance, you heard a lot during the levy discussions about where's the cash balance. Well, the cash balance is going to go down. We've got a deficit spend. We're going to try and minimize our expenditures, try and drop that deficit as much as we can with expenditures. But when it's $3.6 million, that means we're going to be using cash balance to offset. How long that lasts, the 5-year forecast is going to let us know as well. So cash balance will be going down. The contingency fund will eliminate with the hopes that emergency funds are not needed. If emergency funds are needed, that means we're taking something else away, and we're just not going to budget for the contingency funds. And the need for additional revenue, every discussion I had through the levy discussions was that's not going to go away. The additional need for additional revenue is something that will remain. You cannot cut yourself away from a deficit spend when you're looking at 90% of your budget being people. And so the additional revenue, what that looks like, I defer to the board, and Mr. Giuffre and I have had discussions, but I think that's what we're here for, is figuring out what next steps are and how we can not affect kids as much as possible, but it's going to affect kids where we're at now, and it's nothing that we haven't said before. So with that, I will stop.
If I could
Sure.
jump in there real quick before, I'm not trying to stop any discussion, but just a couple of minor points that I wanted to point to Mike that occurred to me. First of all, we have received several community responses. I think one must have just come in.
I think this may have been the fellow.
I know it was a different person.
Oh, was
But
it?
anyway, so I'll let Mike, because I have a couple questions to ask.
Okay.
Either answer it now or somewhere before we're done, if you can.
There have been
Follow-up
several
questions.
community responses
Okay.
that have come in to us via email.
Oh, in the past.
In the
week or so.
past.
Okay.
So I am going to make sure, I have not done this yet, but make sure that all of those responses were copied to Mr. Broadwater and Mr. Giuffre as well. We in fact received a document today that obviously we haven't had time to read yet, but a document concerning finances today. So I just wanted to assure people that those have been received with information, and a couple of things that Mr. Broadwater mentioned that I wanted to make sure he had on his checklist that actually hit on some of the things that those community responses mentioned. And you mentioned it a bit in your report. As we move forward and we say that we need additional funding, some of the questions that I think the board might have are things like, how does pay to participate help? What kind of percentage of help is that for us? We had one community response, I think, that said, if you do away with extracurriculars and make it all outside of the school district. So a whole range of what would that even help us? What kind of percentage of the budget does that even help? There was a question about number of administrators, and I wonder if at some point we could have a reminder of how our administrator cost has changed over time. I saw your FTE response, but just a sense of where we are and where we are perhaps in comparison to other districts. Sure. And then one thing that I noticed was, talked a little bit about grant applications. If we could get a report on how we are doing with grant applications. Sure. I know at one point in my career at this job, we had talked about, we actually needed to hire a grant application person because it is a very time-consuming process. And I don't believe we have such a person. Don't believe we've ever hired such a person. We even talked at one point about, could we get some community help? Are there folks in the community who would come in and help our particular administrators who are trying to get these grant applications written? So maybe if we could get a report on how we're doing as far as grants are included. Right. I just wanted to slide those in on your list of things, as we know we're going to be talking about finances, and they weren't, like my opinion or anything.
There's
Make sure they get recorded.
There's a whole industry now too of contracted services for grant application, where you contract with a company that's what they do. They're working on behalf of a number of organizations. So
and we
had a call with one of those organizations.
When we walked in here, when I walked in here this morning, Adam told me about a new artificial intelligence program that's going to be able to write people's papers for them, recognizing their writing style. Maybe one of the applications could be for
write me a grant.
You plug in, write me a grant application and see what happens.
These are out there. There's free versions of them, and it's scary.
I know. As a team, right. Speaking, I used to be able to review. Well, it's fairly easy, actually, if you ask someone to write something in French. It's pretty easy if they've done it artificially. You can find out that they didn't do it themselves. But, you talked about being a 21-year-old and walking into a room of 26 second graders. It brought me back to the time when I was 20 and I student taught in a class or several classes of 17 and 18-year-old high school students. And, the things that teachers get thrown into is not for the faint of heart, shall we say.
It's not. But so Monday I've got my homework. I got it. We'll get those.
I
Those
just
are good
wanted-
questions.
I'm not necessarily saying the board is asking for those things. Those were things that occurred to me,
Right, they're good questions.
particularly based on the community input that we've seen so far.
The one thing I would caution with grants and alternative funding, having seen strong different types of foundations and grant writing, when you look at trying to develop a budget, unless you know you're getting that every single year,
Right.
it really is augmenting the programs. I'm not,
Right.
poo-pooing it by any means, but it really does augment what we're trying to do. Just like the ESSER funds, awesome. Love having them because we do so many great things with kids. They're going to go away. And then you got to adjust for that. So,
But to go back to your point, and we've had this conversation before, you can't say, okay, well, we got this $100,000 grant for our football team, so therefore we no longer need to fund our football team, right? Because that grant's not going to be there the next year, and it's going to come back to your budget.
right.
We used to evaluate buying tractor trailers in large numbers every year. And if you were in some states of the country willing to invest in alternative energy fuels, that'd be a significant offset, but only for a period of time.
Right.
And then, you have to look at it and say, can I afford it when the state subsidy runs out?
Right.
Are there statutory limits on teacher-student ratio? I know you said we're already second highest in Hamilton County. Obviously, there are real limits on how many kids a teacher can handle in a class, but in terms of statutory,
I've not seen anything.
There is in our labor agreement, there is kind of a target class size. I think it's non-binding,
Right.
but in good faith, everybody's supposed to work towards it.
Yeah, I think some studies will say class size doesn't matter. Class size doesn't matter unless you're the teacher. And I've had classes. I taught 15 years at the high school level. I had algebra 1 classes with 42 kids, and it was awful. You can't give any independent instruction. It's all common sense stuff there. But so the class sizes right now, and we keep track of them at the elementary levels. When you look at our pre-K up through 6th grade, we're right there. There's not much wiggle room.
So I think we're
Finally came in. My phone doesn't receive very well here. I was just checking to make sure that the board had that. Okay.
so we okay to move on.
We are, if everybody's ready for
Mike,
more.
are you?
Yes.
With everything? If normally I ask if anybody else has stuff they want to do, and I'll go last. But today I'd like to ask you to indulge me and let me go first because I'm going to cover a ton of stuff here.
It's the 6 pages. Can we take a 2-minute break first?
Do you want to take a 2-minute break? 'Cause,
Well, we've lost Eric for 2 minutes, so yes,
Sure.
a 2-minute break.
2-minute break. Not a bad idea.
I just know you have a lot to say, which I appreciate.
Just now on your kids. Okay.
We're good to go.
Yeah.
Okay. Good conversation this morning. I hope we're going to have a lot more. Some of what I have to say, I think is going to be a little difficult, but I'm going to look at it. As I will, I've spent the week, a long week, I'll tell you, going over financial analyses and projections that keep bringing the gravity of what I think of as the looming problem home. And I'll get to some analytics in just a few moments. But I also want to say to the public that might, be listening in or later on, that the school's financial position, no kidding around, really needs your attention. Our collective understanding, the board, the administration, the public, our collective understanding of the situation and the decisions that we'll be making down the road may have potentially significant ramifications on our community. The reality is that school funding and property taxes don't work in Ohio the way you would expect them to. And it's easy to misunderstand all kinds of important points. Along with that, it's hard to explain it all. And there's been a lot said, over the course of not just the last few months, but the last several years. Unfortunately, not all of it has been accurate. So please, all of you, please take this seriously. Don't be told how to think. Ask difficult questions. Be open-minded as you're engaging with each other. Please don't fall into disrespect of opposing viewpoints or vilification of others. We just don't get anywhere with that. This is a hard business problem and a community problem that's in front of us. And we can only solve this with good understanding and good intent. So please keep that in mind. As I say, make it a mission to find the truth, which sometimes is hard to get to because these are hard to understand subjects. I'd also say that there may be people who have been very supportive of our schools, but are financially challenged to show it with their checkbooks. To all of you, I say simply that I know you must make hard decisions that balance both your personal and your civic responsibilities. And I do think we all have civic responsibilities that are part of this conversation. You have to make those trade-offs within whatever your means are. Nevertheless, I appreciate your support of the school's mission, and I do that without any reservation whatsoever. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you try to do. That's not the problem here. There may also be people who are what I think of as ideologically opposed to public education. And to them, I say, please make sure that you are not painting our schools and teachers with concerns that you read about elsewhere in the country. Loveland is Loveland. It's not one of the places that's routinely out there making headlines because we are simply and entirely focused on just doing it right for our students. I would tell you again, I sit in the middle of a whole lot of conversations all year long, and I don't see what I read about. I'm not saying that there isn't something once in a while that comes up, but that's not descriptive of who we are. This is a right down the middle, care about the kids, do it right kind of environment. As I've been trying to explain throughout all of the levy discussion, there are key facts that are widely misunderstood, but remain an undeniable background for the rest of this discussion. Based on the most recent data available, and I hope sometime in the next week or two, we'll see updated CUP reports. But based on the most recent data available, our schools are actually well controlled financially, costing 2.7% less per student than the average of all 607 school districts in the state. Yet get the highest performance ratings, higher than 595 other schools. These remain easily documentable facts. On the other hand, Loveland, from a resident's perspective, is also highly taxed, but not because of high school costs, rather the result of not having a lot of business to absorb some of the tax burden. along with low state funding driven by our very high average income and property values. The schools aren't the villain in this problem. I suggest when we go out and vote on police and fire levies, I don't think that we limit our decision to whether we personally might someday need their help. I think we also think about the day our neighbor or a neighbor's business might need that help. So we routinely provide all the funding. That's, I think, a fact. We provide all the funding they ask for. But that's the way communities work. And I'd argue the schools are no different. We're here every day to provide for any and every child as one of our most important community assets, and in fact, a pillar that Loveland is built on. Not only have these schools helped launch untold numbers of successful students into adulthood, but they are also the schools where the community comes together to help support kids with needs private schools don't address. It takes all of these assets together to make it work. And didn't know we were going to get into it, but we had a ton of discussion about that very aspect to the public schools earlier today. The tough message is that you get what you pay for. It's been a fantastic community built in part upon great schools. But that will inevitably change if the schools degrade from lack of reasonable funding. Yes, we must find ways to stretch our dollars and doing as little long-term harm as we can going forward. A lot of my comments will be about this. But it is a progressive problem. The longer we go without reasonable tax revenue, the more damaging this process of stretching becomes. We've heard some of this already today, but there are already families who struggle to get their kids to the high school. And some of those are the ones whose futures are most challenged. And I, for one, and I think I'm not alone in this, can't let go of the need to fix things like that. I don't know how to fix them right now, but I can't just say, forget about it. We are now moving into the 9th year of relatively fixed tax revenue. 9 years. Doing exactly the same things, having exactly the same teachers and staff, exactly the same programs, exactly the same buildings to maintain. Our costs rise relentlessly each year as inflation has its way. The cumulative effect of 9 years of fixed revenue is literally pounding at the door. So I have spent a lot of time. I want to share something with you. On the screen, I think this is getting broadcast as well. And it's good. Okay, so this is a chart that I've shared at least an earlier version of at the 2 previous board meetings. And what I've done here is to just take publicly available data off of Rob's, either Rob's website or Board Docs. And I think I went back 52 months and I go forward, I want to say maybe something like 48 individual months, analyzing our monthly disbursements and our monthly revenue. And if you look at this period over here, let me get this pulled up a little bit higher. Basically, up until November is actual data. All this, right? And we go up and we go down, and that's the literal effect of what we've talked about a number of times. Big tax payments from the county arriving twice a year. So our balance goes way up. And then we live off of that for give or take the next 6 months. And we pay out something like $4.5 million or so per month in running the district. And the vast majority of that, as we've said, is wages and benefits. But it goes up and it goes down. The $14 million number that got thrown around so much last year is such a distraction from what the real picture is that, it's a little dangerous to focus on that because it's not about that. What it's really about is how long does a balance last and how low does it get before you get a new check deposited into the account. So you'll see here a couple of colored lines. The yellow line represents an average of 60 days of our disbursement. So basically 2 months worth of payments. That's a threshold that many treasurers in the state tend to use as a guideline to don't fall below that because you don't know what happens later on. The red line is 30 days. And that's when things get super touchy because you don't know where you're going to have the money, when you're going to have to write checks. Violating the red line is maybe a situation where you can't write checks because you don't have the cash in the bank. It wiggles a little bit because it's both of those lines wiggle a little bit because as opposed to the last time I showed this to you, these are now built on 6-month moving averages. So they update based on what the trend of expenses or revenues are. The dotted line in here is my attempt to factor back in ESSER. And this would be the ESSER that would be kind of associated with employees that are going to stay here tomorrow. So if you were seeing the expense, which is hidden because it's charged to the ESSER account, if you were seeing it, the cash balance wouldn't be up here. It'd be more like down here. Okay. So that's kind of the history. Then we get to the future. And what I've done over here, and this is a different approach than Rob's 5-year forecast. This is my forecast, and it's far simpler. In a lot of ways, it's far less arguable because all I've really done is to take our historical true expense load, that's sort of adjusted now, true expense load, and say that reasonably it's going to increase by some percentage. The percentage can be an arguable one, and I'll talk about it more in a second. But I've also done the same thing with revenue. And in this particular model at the moment, it's a higher number than I normally use. But to make it foot to Rob's revenue projections, which I don't think are really arguable, it's about 1.25 points growth per year in revenue. And that's largely attributable to new homes and sales, but the core doesn't really change very much. The rate of growth that I've factored in here right now is 4.6%. And that's essentially what Rob had built into the forecast going forward. Higher than I would normally like to use. And then I tore into where did you get that number from? And it's largely a blending of expected salary increases, something maybe in the 3.5% kind of range, with benefit increases that are substantially higher. I want to say it's more like 5.5%. And the blend of those two yields something close to this 4.6. So, we can argue that 4.6 is a good growth rate or not. The problem with it is, as we were talking about earlier, we have contracts that are due this year, and we don't know where all of that is going to go. So this is the most sensitive part of the model. Changing that a little bit can change the flow of cash fairly significantly. But for the moment, let me stay at the 4.6. And
can I just ask
yes,
a quick
please.
question, Kevin? Yeah. Does that 4.6 also take into an attempt for things other than benefits to be at the 3 to 3.5 level? In other words, there aren't other things in there that are above, because that has been our attempt of recent years, is to stay at or below that level.
If you look at his 5-year forecast, he'll have, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 pages in there, separate pages on different categories of expenditures. And you'll see that in those other categories, he doesn't have anything really close to this.
Okay.
Right. So they're generally far less. This is really being driven by wages and also benefits. And again, you can argue about the wages. I think you've got a pretty good handle on the benefit situation. Maybe we could take a bet and say we're not going to see, 3.5% of wage. Maybe we'll see something less than that, but you don't know. So for the moment, I'm running with the 4.6 with everything else, and I can change it on the fly here if you want to see
I just want to
the
make
effect
sure
of it.
that
Right?
was.
What starts to happen here, and so I've used, let's see, let me get this set up right so you can see it properly. As opposed to fiscal years, I've put these blue vertical lines to outline calendar years. And the reason I did that is that, effectively the revenue that we get to talk about is on a calendar year. So 23 is done. There's no, at least levy revenue to be had incrementally in 23. It is what it is. And then I allow elsewhere in the model, if we want to play with it, what happens if we had this much of a millage or that much of a millage? How does it change this picture at different points in time? But what this says at the 4.6 rate of expense growth is that we get pretty close to the caution line at the end of this year, really the first of 24, pretty close. This is largely what we've been saying, that 2023 isn't an emergency, but it's starting to become a problem. And the real problem shows up shortly thereafter. And you can see what happens down here, that we're in danger of breaching the red line by the end of 24. So 23 was get ready, try to solve this problem before it becomes a problem, because now we're kind of up against the wall here. If we don't solve it during the course of 23, and therefore realize revenue in 24, which is the first time we would realize it, right? 24 looks really pretty yucky, and I'll show you what we have to do to fix that.
Right.
Okay.
And 23 looks like that, apart from any reduction in expenses
Not yet.
or addition of funds, because
Correct.
funds cannot come till 2024. So doing nothing in 2023 is what gets us
Correct.
there.
And that's the point of the model now, that first it demonstrates what really happens with cash. This is the real world. What really happens with cash over the course of time. And then once you know that there is what I called my opening comment, a looming problem, you have an obligation to do something about it. And right now, I'd argue all you can do, well, I'll take you through 10 things I think we can do, but let's say for the most part, you got to save some money in order to preserve your ability to stay in business going forward. You can talk about new revenue in 23, but you won't see it until 24. Okay, so over here, in this little area, this area over here, this is what I call austerity reductions. And it's not intended to be saying that you have to do this entirely through wages and benefits. But I do translate it to wages and benefits. The reality is you wouldn't do it through just one tactic. You would do it through an array of tactics, okay? And I'll save a little bit of time. You can tell me to try different things, but I've been playing with it enough, and I have some suggestions here to get us started. So I'm uncomfortable not doing anything in 23, because if I don't do anything in 23, I have to do it all in 24. And it becomes very, very painful to do it in 24. Eric,
Sorry, and I apologize for saying, when you say I'm uncomfortable doing anything in 23, were you talking about decreasing expenses, increasing revenues, or both? And I'm
quite literally both.
Okay.
Quite literally both. Although I think that the practical thing is that you have more control over expenses than you do over revenues.
Well, the only way to increase revenues marginally or significantly is through a levy.
Significantly, yeah. There's some other things that maybe you could do, but how material they turn out to be is
Especially in a short time period.
right. You don't know. All right. So let me say, for the sake of argument, that Mike targets 2% reduction in 23. That moves them. It's this blue line now has moved comfortably off the yellow line, right? The reddish orange line is what it was before. Okay. So a 2% reduction just gives us a little bit of comfort in 23. It equates to about $1 million worth of savings, worth of reductions. If you were to do it entirely through teachers, because I think Mike would argue that he can't do it through bus drivers. He needs every bus driver he can get. And if he did do it through bus drivers, the state would have something to say to us about us failing our transportation imperatives. So it's not really an option. But $1 million, I might argue, on the average, is about 9 teacher FTEs. 9. And it really is more than that because that's at the average. And because if we did get into forced reductions in headcount, that works on seniority. So the newest teachers who are earning the least amount of money are the first to go. And therefore, 9, if you were doing it this way, and I don't recommend you do it exactly this way, but 9 might become 12 or 15 or something like that. And to put that in perspective, 9 would represent 4% of the workforce coming out. Okay, it still doesn't solve our problem in 24. So let's say that we did that now, and we started to bank a little bit of cushion in 23, and a levy goes up either in the early part of 23 or the later part of 23, and it fails. So now you have to deal with a much more significant problem in 24. And to cure that one, let's see here if this works. 4% doesn't do it. Let me try 5%. 5% doesn't quite do it. Let me try 6%. Okay, so 6% is roughly what you need to get back above the caution area. And shockingly,
I'm sorry, Kevin, you're talking about there's a 2% cut in 23 and then a 6% cut in 24.
So these are now cumulative. I'm sorry, you have to add them together.
Right.
So we had 9 in 23. We would have 30 in 24. We're up to 39. Again, some of this you wouldn't do, and some of this is actually worse than what I'm showing, right? It's because of the averages, and you're going to go on seniority. So the least expensive people go first. But you're not only.
I don't want to derail anything, but the actual 23, if there were cuts in staff, would only be half of that year because it wouldn't happen until. But that would significantly affect the graph.
So excellent point. If I did this from a what would you actually do kind of perspective, when could you actually do it? I'd actually have to have 4% up there instead of 2 in order to get the full year impact that I'm showing. Right.
Thanks.
But now, I think I was starting to say you're up to 15% of the workforce, and God forbid if we can't get it done in 24 for 25. What do I have to do then? I think I did this one already. I think it takes 7.5 doesn't do it. 8. Let me try 10 here. Let me stop there.
Yeah.
This is getting crazy. It's getting crazy, right? But I'm now at 82, 90, 91 headcount reductions, and I think Mike would argue we've fallen apart at that level.
Well, you've reduced by a third, correct?
You're
teaching we have
staff.
to reduce it by 34% by that point, right? So what I'm just demonstrating here is that the problem is cumulative. It's very real. You have to do something about it. So again, if we got lucky or fortunate, let me say, and we didn't have 4.6% growth up here, and it turns out to be something less than that, this is not so draconian. It's still not pretty, but it's it's an easier situation.
So can you demonstrate that?
Do you mind
Yeah,
putting
so
that to
let me put
3.5
in
to
there.
right,
Okay.
3.5 or 3 or whatever you pick it.
Let me put 4 in there. So things, you can see everything gets healthier with significantly healthier than, so we don't need these levels of reductions. So let me go back to these being 0, and I'll keep the 2% in 23, just because I know that 24 is still a problem. But instead of, what did I do before? At 4 or 5%?
It was 4.
And so now, let me see if maybe 3%.
Well, you had 6 there
would
before.
do it.
Oh, so it's 6.
Yeah.
Okay, so, kind of cut it in half here. So instead of it being 6, I can get okay at 3%. So I'm at 24 headcount cumulatively by that point in time. If I was able to achieve the 4.0, which is me saying, 3.5 on wages, and then, I got to deal with the benefit problem, and it's a bad benefit cost year, so I have to deal with that. Maybe I can get to 4. Who knows?
I know this is hard because of the ESSER fluctuations we've had recently, but what has been our historical rate of growth?
I do. I have it here, Eric. I don't know if I'm prepared to.
That's okay. You don't necessarily, because my understanding is
I want to say it's in the 4s.
right. It's less than we have projected, but not
Correct.
Dramatically less than we have projected in our current 5-year budget.
A good deal of the first year. Well, let me explain it this way. You've got a very in Rob's forecast. You've got a very significant 23 forecast. There are 2 things that work there fundamentally. One is that he loads the contingency in there, which is, he's really worked hard to try to explain this, and I'm really beginning to understand more clearly what he's saying. It's not a cash item until you actually spend it,
right?
But he's reserving that room in there. So in this analysis, I've taken it all out, and I've said, what happens, right? If we get slammed with a whole bunch of mandatory expenditures, we just got, it'll be what it is. We have no reserve for it. So I've just taken that out, and that's a good chunk of his increase. The rest of it is coming off of the ESSER.
Right.
Absorption of expenses. And I think that probably explains the majority of that steep rise. And then he comes back down to something that's more modest in the subsequent years. It's kind of interesting. I end up pretty close in the out years to his level of annual disbursements, doing it my way as he does. So he may be off. I don't think he's, dramatically off.
I agree with you. And I think that the problem with the contingency thing was just the fact of its introduction and that it was different than it was before. So it always raised questions, but essentially it accounted for some of the cash that we already had. Instead of just taking it out of your cash balance, it came out of this part of the budget. But it's the same. We've had this conversation. It's the same money either way.
Right. So here I did allow room to plug in some levy numbers. I don't know if you want to try some of those and see how they change things. But
the part of the conversation that we get away from, and I had a slide up there, is that bottom number of 9. That bottom number has already been 47 a couple of years ago.
Right.
And you cut 9, you cut 15. Are you cutting your way out of this deficit?
Oh, you're just delaying it.
No. So that kind of, this graphically proves the point. You're going to have to cut 15 people a year just to maintain. And that's where the additional revenue, as reasonable as possible, is what you need. But I just want to.
Well, the alternative to maintain is just nobody gets any raises forever.
Right.
And I'm exaggerating to prove the point. But again, then you never get a new teacher to come to Loveland again.
Right. If you stopped it right now, I can put 0% growth in there, and you'll see that we're okay.
Right.
But that's not the real world, right?
Guarantee a strike.
The economy doesn't work that way. So
If I can just say, Kevin, I don't know. I mean, I do know, but I don't know exactly how much time you're thinking, like you suggested, putting in levy numbers. We're at 11:11
Okay.
now.
Let me,
So I just want to make sure that
Right.
there's time for what you want to present
let me do the
and
rest of
make
it.
sure there's time for what people want to ask about.
If
Obviously, we're not going to come to a conclusion today,
Right.
but I want to make sure that everybody gets their
Right.
information.
To me, this is really helpful way to craft unless, because I don't have any additional things. So this
Right.
is,
Okay, I just want to make sure that we all knew where we were
I'm
time-wise.
not a fan of talking about levies today.
Well, I would like to,
I really want to talk about the real world right now.
I understand where you're coming from, but just to give us an idea of like, so 2023, you're
It's
going
done.
to show input in 2024.
Actually, I
How is
apply
your
it
model
to the
set?
current year.
Okay, gotcha.
So if you wanted me to put in a 4.9
Right.
to, I would put it in the 2024 cell.
Well, just throw in, I don't care what you throw in. I put 4.9. So this is what we had asked for in November.
So
And
we
what
come
does that
off,
do? Right.
We come off caution pretty well.
Is this 26?
That is,
Oh, sorry.
That's touchscreen.
that is 26.
Click in now.
25, 26 school year.
Click that.
Sorry.
Oh, wait, actually, I think it's me.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
here.
Or is it?
I think it's you.
So wait, so I make sure the blue line is what now and the
The
orange?
blue line is adjusted.
With this,
The red line
cuts.
is
With no cuts.
with no cuts. So the blue line represents 2 and 3% reductions in 23, 24. And it represents
Now,
a 4.9 levy only in 24.
And the red line was what it would have been without any of this.
Correct.
Got it.
No, the 4.9 levy only in 24. Okay, gotcha.
And I really should put it
You
in
should put it in 25
25
and 26 as well.
Right.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and do
All right.
that. So that all comes up off the
Got it.
line, right?
Got it.
What this doesn't show, because it doesn't go out far enough,
It doesn't show
is
our
the life of
increasing.
the levy.
Well, it also doesn't show our increasing costs, I think.
Well, they're still in there.
Okay.
I mean, you can see here,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
we're
Okay.
down to the 4% growth rate.
this is a little lower cash than that is.
Okay. I'm with you.
That's, again, inflation having its way. So if you were to put a levy in of 4.9 for these 3 years, and I had stretched this thing out a few more years, eventually you would see us back down on the yellow line.
Well, and again, just to go on, don't touch it.
You still have the 9 and 15 in there.
Correct.
Just
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and again, the problem in part is that 23 is essentially in the books.
Right.
It's
Right.
done. The only thing you do is just kind of drive the expense load down and give yourself a little bit of cushion.
So if you take the 24 austerity reduction out.
Yep, coming up.
That's, yeah.
Right.
And I think the biggest thing that's always frustrating but true to me is that cutting FTEs, you've gotten rid of your least expensive
That's the real
employees.
problem.
And then if somebody goes, why are you paying your teachers so much? Well,
Right.
you just drove out all the expensive ones. So
Your
we're like-
averages actually will come
Go
up
up.
as you do that.
And to keep going back to Mike's point, we've cut employees to the point where cutting employees, any employees, whether it's the 9, 10, 11 here, is dangerous. It's not like we have a lot of employees to
Yeah.
cut at this point.
Yeah.
You have really begun to cut into what is needed. I think at one point, Mike made a point of if you cut, you're beginning to affect the safety of our students. You're beginning to not just affect their academic growth, but you're beginning to affect the actual safety of our students.
Right. So if you're okay, you've gotten the fundamental message here. Let me make a few other comments and then we can just chat.
We've gotten the message that Kevin has a really cool toy.
Yeah.
That if I'm just.
Do me,
that's
I'm
not
sorry.
nice.
Do
It's
me
a
a
very
favor.
important tool, but it's.
Just to graphically represent this, and I hate to take this time because I know we don't have a lot left.
No.
Change the 4.9 to 3.
3 even.
Yeah.
3, 3, and 3.
Okay.
Gives you a little bit of life.
And this is an example of what we've been saying all along as well. The 4.9, you can stretch, so you can get years and continue to manage the way we're managing. As that number goes down, then the length of, it's just common sense.
Okay, so again, if you're okay, let me let me stop sharing this. And then I've got a few other things to say, which is kind of built on experience with the world that I'm familiar with, of having actually done some of this stuff. Yeah, as a matter of fact. So I said last month that we wouldn't like what fixing the funding shortfall would look like. Remember me saying that? Right. Well, there's more to come here. Depending on how long the lack of new funding persists, the reality is that, and you started to internalize it just now, we will be overseeing the disassembly of the district, a little bit at a time, until something changes. This isn't always clear to everybody, but make no doubt, once we start this, we don't have complete control over where it goes. And the reasoning on that is that this is a real people business. I mean, this is, kind of what I did for a living. This is a real people business. And we need to account for the impact. This is, what Mike's been trying to tell us. Account for the impact of everything we do on its human beings. People react to circumstances. Lack of new funding, now closing in on, I'm going to say it, almost a decade. I was asking my daughter what grade she was in 2014. And I think she was a junior in high school, she said, long time ago. Almost a decade of this will result, this is not fear-mongering, this is human nature, right? Will result in employees taking control of their futures and getting out from under the dark cloud of uncertain community support, negativity, the inevitable decline in employment stability, income growth, and maybe more importantly than everything, a clear, exciting future. What can I see down the road? Many of you, all of us, I think, have found ourselves in similar situations at some point in our lives. We've kind of touched on this, but the hard, largely unnoticed work that's gone into restructuring our union contracts will actually become meaningless as the young new talent we've hired and plan to yet hire with new salary scales will leave either on their own for more positive settings. When people have options, they take them.
Well,
is what really happens in the world.
Kevin, I don't want to interrupt too much, but you hit the nail on the head. The mobility of teachers is highest in the first 7 years.
Right.
So we act as the training ground for other districts who come in and then they move on to someplace else with a rosier picture.
And what I also found with Wittenberg and we were freezing salaries is you also lose of that cohort. You lose your most talented of that cohort because they're the most mobile.
I mean, to put it kind of bluntly, they don't need this. They don't need all this stuff, right? Because they were very desirable young employees when we hired them. If this is going to be a really nasty environment, I can go someplace else. I've got no ties to the community. I've got no ties because I have no pension build up or anything else going on here. I just go someplace else where they're going to love me, take care of me, and I'll have a great future.
It also
I don't need the drama anymore.
Yeah, it affects your hiring practice that we've tried to instill, which is we get the best and the brightest right now, so we can't hire at a lower,
So they either leave on their own, or as we've been talking a little bit about here, they may eventually end up being part of a forced seniority-based reduction plan. People leaving a bad situation, I think we have to be realistic about it. Leaving a bad situation isn't limited to staff. It's likely that we're going to see the same thing with families who leave the schools or even the community. I know we've been told some of these already in search of more stable alternatives. The resulting increased burden, think about this one, because I don't think we talk about it at all, but the resulting increased burden on the private schools in our geography with increasing enrollment because parents don't want to be a part of this potential mess either. If I can afford it, I'll go over to the private schools, but the private schools don't have unlimited capacity. So I don't know what it would actually look like, but I wouldn't be surprised that you end up with waiting lists and supply and demand takes over and tuition grows and all that kind of stuff. In any event, there's unforeseen impacts on that side of it. And people may not realize it, but I think all of us at this table have been talked to by other folks who are talking about our growing reputation for not being able to support the schools. It's becoming noticed. And it's one of the things that all of us should be concerned about. I think with its inevitable impact on the desirability of Loveland and our collective property values. So I do think, and again, I'm not trying to be an alarmist. I'm just saying, after a decade of this kind of stuff, and you start to see real impacts, there are consequences, and you can't walk away from this stuff. Loveland will look different. So I think the future is very difficult if these funding problems continue much longer. Again, the beauty of having it come up this past November is that it didn't create an emergency. We have time to talk about it and think about what can we possibly still yet do. I continue to urge we try everything to push off forced headcount reductions. To me, that's almost the end of the line. While we work with the community to solve for reasonable funding options and avoid all these issues I've been talking about. I've put together a quick list of 10 possible areas so far for an austerity strategy until our future funding picture improves. These are roughly in order of decreasing desirability. Right? Easy first, kind of terrible at the end. And a number of these Mike has already talked about. I've been talking to Mike and Rob for some time about all these things, and I was delighted to hear that they're already thinking about a number of them. All right, so first on the list is direct the treasurer to revise our investment strategy as needed to maintain needed liquidity. In other words, we've got investment instruments, bonds, et cetera. No focus on investment, focus on liquidity. We don't want you to liquidate a bond and pay a penalty on it unless things get really, really bad. But in the meantime, as they mature, take the cash, bank it, and cash is king. So do what you have to do. Mike talks a lot about the $3.6 million spending deficit. I'm going to say embrace part of that deficit. Don't try to solve it all at once, because I showed you basically $1 million of savings, and we don't like that. $3.5 million of savings, which would kind of maintain our cash balance for a much, much longer period of time, is going to be really, really nasty. So accept a degree of cash balance reduction, buy into it, but set up our budgets to target 60-day minimum cash on hand as we look at the year. Figure out what that's going to take to get. I mean, this is Kevin's work. Rob really needs to do it and figure out it. And Mike, working with the staff, I think, figure out in very detail, how can you get $1 million or something like that to protect us right now? Adopt a policy, and he's already done this. I'm just calling it a policy now. Adopt a policy of voluntary force reduction until new funding provides reasonably secure stability. So it's not a rule, it's policy, which means that if he has retirements and resignations in the past, he might have shuffled the deck and I might have used a headcount from here for somebody that I needed over here. Now take the net reduction, right? Unless you cannot handle it. Let's say, for example, you lose a physics teacher, it's a very specialized kind of thing, and you actually need to go out and hire the physics teacher. You just have to do some things. Okay, fine. But from a directional perspective, allow voluntary departures to inch us down, because every one of those is one that we don't have to force later on. Number 4, direct, hopefully the new, we haven't seen it yet. We keep talking about it, but we haven't seen it yet. The new TIF revenue when it arrives from Sims Township, which is maybe in the $400,000 a year range, to operations, day-to-day operations. But this is the twist on it. Keep it visible as possible future funding for reinstatement of high school busing. If we can get our way through funding the day-to-day business or an eventual levy, whatever, this is money that can pretty much cover the cost of bringing back high school busing and maybe keep it out of any levy requests down the road. But for now, cash is king. We need to push it towards paying the bills, and we'll see if things can change later on. That's not a reality yet. right? We're told this is coming, but we've been working on it for over a year. So we'll have to see. Examine the potential, this is number 5, examine the potential for a 501c3 to accept community contributions and direct those monies to district operations. So this is go to the community. We had one community member say, I'd like to donate what I would have paid in incremental property taxes back to the district. Great sentiment. Not everybody will do that, but set up a fund that hopefully would make it tax deductible for them, but be able for us to use it for day-to-day operations. I don't know if the tax implications of that are as clear as I just easily said they would be. We have to work through that. But that's kind of going out to the community and saying, voluntarily, give us a hand.
Is that something that's, no matter whether we were talking about austerity measures, levies, is that something that is long-term?
I don't think so. Worth it. Is another story. I was going to say, I don't think it's long-term viable, but helpful for sure. And the reason I say I'm not sure it's viable is if we establish this thing based on our current need and in lieu of property taxes, right? And eventually property taxes, a levy is approved. I think you'll find a lot of people saying, okay, well, I'm going to just pay for my property taxes. I'm not going to make contributions to the 501c3 anymore. I think there's other things that we can do with the foundation, et cetera. But my experience, and I've worked a lot with Xavier, and I've worked with Easter Seals on fundraising kinds of things. People are willing to invest big money. Wealthy people are willing to invest big money, but a lot of times they want their name on something.
So that's what was my point, was that is completely outside
Correct.
Of the notion of the foundation. It's
Correct.
very
I
specific.
think so.
Okay.
I think so. This is targeted, and then again, this is from the fundraising exposure that I've had with two, kind of significant institutions in the area, and working with their professional fundraising people. Getting folks to spend money on operations is much, much harder than getting them to, build a building or some such thing. So that's just the reality of it. Maybe we'd find that we had a different outcome. I don't say certainly we need to pursue everything, but just be realistic in what our expectations are on things like this. Number 6 on my list is develop a non-personnel savings plan, essentially scrubbing every non-employee expenditure item in the budget for reduction. Things like fixed assets that have to be replaced. Hold on to the Chromebooks for another year. Normally, we don't like to spend good money after bad, but when cash is king, you got to do what you got to do. I used a little bit the example of letting the grass grow longer. To me, it's no kidding around. If we mow the lawn every week, make it every other week or every 3 weeks. Save dimes wherever you can save dimes. Individually don't matter a lot, unfortunately, but you do enough of those, maybe you save a head count or two or something like that at the end of the day. This gets even more disagreeable now. Examine the potential for fee escalations. More disagreeable yet, examine potential for non-bargaining unit employee salary freezes. We don't get to do that with the bargaining units, but we can potentially do it, and it'll be an extremely unpopular move with the staff. But if you're trying to stay alive, sometimes you've got to do unpopular things. Number 9 on the list is if all else fails, now you go to involuntary reduction in force strategies. Now, because we tried everything. It's deeper in the year. We hadn't got a levy passed, et cetera, et cetera. We have to go where the real money is, and that's unfortunately human beings. And we pay a price for that. Number 10, and only a few of you know that I've been thinking about this, but begin exploration of what in the business world we would call strategic alternatives. In the business world, when you're out of options, you start thinking about throwing it all up in the air and looking to change the fundamental nature of your business. And that can mean potentially re-architecting the district, merging with another district, things of that nature. I've done a little bit of legal research on it. I understand a little bit about, what it would take. It's certainly plausible to do such a thing. It's relatively unheard of. There have to be some benefit for a partner that we would bring to the party. I tend to think about these in terms of logistics. And do we have a school building that really better physically aligned with a neighboring district, and it can work for them? We bring a lot of, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but we bring a lot of baggage to the party. And, in the merger world, somebody's got to love you in order to marry you. So we may not be so lovable at the moment, but I don't think that should, you can't pass a levy, et cetera, right? So somebody else is going to inherit this problem and what have you. Those become problematic elements, but I don't think if we get to this level of concern that we should rule out kind of very significant kinds of changes like that. So the cash situation will deteriorate at an increasing pace going forward. You can see that. The plan I've laid out, though, is progressive, allowing us to see if we can secure funding to prevent going deeper into the list and escalating the reductions. The longer we wait, however, the bigger the issue becomes. So I think, as I've been saying, action in 23 is wise to help limit the impact on 24, where the issues clearly become much more severe. That's, it gets worse increasingly over time. The lack of new revenue over multiple years will cause major issues. So, and I mean, you can see eventually we're way down in the red if this thing continues much longer. So we need to make sure that the public understands the gravity of the problem. Maybe it's not so bad at the moment, but bad is kind of around the corner.
And Kevin, and I don't know much about this, and thank you. That was a great breakdown of all of the things that we can do to help to stave off to the future the problems that we will inevitably have with no future revenue. Where do the state safety nets fall in, and what does that look like? For instance, like once we go below 60 days of cash on hand, and once we go below 30 days of cash on hand.
Yeah. Okay. So Mr. Giuffre and I have been going back and forth on this. If you read the ORC and if you read the auditor guidance, it says one thing that tells me we're already there. We're already in caution. But Rob thinks that that's not worded correctly. So we're not sure. So he has reached out to the state to get clarification on it. And I think he's planning on inviting a representative from the auditor's office to one of our meetings to explain this. The way it's worded out there is if your current year deficit exceeds 2% of your prior year revenue, you're in caution. There can be other elements, right? And the worse that gets, you move from caution to watch to emergency. And when you get to emergency, from what we understand of the process, they basically appoint a CEO to come in and tell you what to do. And
I'm not sure I would call that a safety net.
but I mean, this is the eventual process if you can't solve your own problems. The state, this is a little bit more
to go back,
taking it over.
I agree with you 100%, but like, I would hope that the safety net doesn't get us to this point where we let go 40% of our staff, but maybe it does. I don't know.
Right. Good.
I don't know.
Right.
So I should be aware of it. That's actually the point I had here, that I have had that conversations with Rob, and he's going to help answer it, more definitively. Last thing I'm going to say is that I personally am reluctant to get into future levy strategies without some clear understanding of what caused the 52% in November to say no. This is not to say I'm against going back for a levy, because I'm a business guy, I'm a realist, and the writing is clearly on the wall. This is a problem, and it's going to be here, and we can take control of our futures or let it take control of us. And I think we've got to do what we can do, but do it in a way that has a better chance of being successful than we were in November. And to me, that is, the fact that I don't think there's any one, I'm guessing there's no one reason in the 52%. There's an array of reasons, some of which we can't deal with. I mean, if you're just fundamentally against new taxes, or you're fundamentally against public school, I'm going to do that, right? Or if you just can't afford it, you don't have the money to do it, nothing we can do about that. But if there are other things that are in there, the type of levy, the duration of levy, all these other kinds of things, and that has the chance of pushing a levy over the wire, I think we've got to be open and listen to it, but we've got to go out and find out what those folks are saying. I don't know how to, if I was in the business world,
Right.
it'd be underway right now. But we are very limited in what we can do. So we may have to rely on the PACs or whatever to go out and do the research. And I do think that research has to occur, and it needs to happen very, very quickly, because the timeline, we're going to go for a May levy, will be upon us in the blink of an eye. So, in any event, I would want to know if we can address the objections that they had. The cash position, as I tried to describe, won't allow this to take very long, but I do think we need to do our best to get some objective answers as quickly as possible. So that's my piece.
Thank you.
We discussed before you get questions for all of this, just to real quick, because my voice is pretty much gone. We did suggest, we have a January 10th meeting set. January 18th and January 31st were added into that calendar in some extent to meet those deadlines for if the board were to consider a May levy. So what the board needs to consider, based on Kevin's last comment, is there a desire for some sort of community input session prior to that, or make one of those meetings or something? The January 10th meeting, the organizational meeting, there's a lot of business. We'll actually start at 5. There'll be a budget hearing before the organizational meeting. I don't know how much business will be on there in addition to just the organization, which is usually relatively quick. You elect officers, you do all of those setting bonds and those kinds of things that you do just as a regular annual thing. So one of the things that we need to talk about is ways to perhaps get additional information, and whether that involves a meeting or not, or whether we're happy with those meetings and can continue to
to go back
discuss.
to the town hall concept, could that be built into, we're going to hold 4 town halls next year, and the one in January will be about finances?
I would say, from kind of a consumer research perspective, absolutely. We should absolutely do such a thing. But I think it's woefully inadequate.
Right. That's my
It's what I would call qualitative kind of information, kind of focus group oriented. The problems with it is that there's all kinds of bias in the data, right? Who shows up?
Right. Who
is a
shows up?
bias, right? Interested people. Well, you don't necessarily know that the interested people are everybody that's going to show up at the polls, etc. So you don't know, but it is an input, and I think it's very, very, very worthwhile, in addition to some kind of scientific survey approach. Now, whether we get the scientific survey done or not, I don't know.
Because my understanding is we can't pay for that.
We can't even ask the question, is what I've been told. I've researched whether we can just ask our parents, how did they vote? What do they think? And there is some caution. Everybody is walking on eggshells right now legally. So the advice has been to steer clear of doing it directly, which is why I said a moment ago, I think somebody outside of the district will have to do it, the PACs and whoever will have to do that.
I know the PAC at least discussed it, but I don't know where they've gone with that.
I don't know. It is, the Ohio Department of Education was supposed to come out with guidelines months ago. They have not done it. I don't think, people that are not familiar with how schools run, I think people would say, why don't you ask us? Why don't you survey? It's common sense says you should be able to do that.
Right.
Well, we can't do that.
It's crazy stuff.
And so it's the only way. It's just like going through the strategic vision process. We want to hear from people, but they got to listen to us when these meetings are and when they're going to be
They're
there.
going to show up.
They have to show up.
Well, and again, and I really appreciate you guys coming, and I know that you're very interested in what's going on, but how many people spend 4 hours on a Saturday to do this?
Right.
Well, even recent meetings for public participation, it's very rare. It often happens after we do something, that there's a large response to something rather than in a meeting situation. I do think it is better now than it has been in the past, the amount of information that comes to us through emails that are directed to the entire board. I think that is good. It's useful. It's not always things that we haven't already considered or things that we are actually able to do, but we do get some of that. But to me, it has been very difficult to have people come to en masse a meeting kind of situation until we do something that either really pleases somebody or really upsets somebody. And then we get that kind of response.
And then you're either going to get the upset people or the pleased people there.
And that's the bias in the sampling problem.
Right.
And I do want to reiterate, this is decade number 5. I have been dealing with this for 5 decades. This is not new to Loveland. This is not new to state finance. This is how it works. And we're the only state that does this to get an incremental operational bump in the state of Ohio.
When I first started on the board, we had a principal who said, the only way you get people to come to your meetings is if you're going to talk about buses or beans. They only want to know whether their kid's going to be picked up on their cul-de-sac or what they're going to eat for lunch. So it's, it is, and it has been true over the years. Obviously, this is affecting buses and a lot of bean counting, but that's a little bit different kind of beans. But
my concern is that Loveland is a couple years ahead of everybody else, which is the system is not sustainable, built on the backs of just property taxes. And Loveland has a unique burden compared to many districts about a low business base and a high property tax base.
And high income.
So the state has less interest in supporting it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with looming changes to state funding. I mean, I hate to be the Debbie Downer here, but if you think there's going to be changes to state funding, you think that's going to help us? It's going to be a deeper reach into our pocket is what it's more likely to be.
And might I also, the model that you put, and Mr. Doherty obviously spends a lot of time doing this and has expertise in it, and it really helps me. But the model you put together is based on the assumption that the state funding is not going to change.
Right.
And if the state funding changes, which it's coming up next year, I'm going to guess Loveland's not going to get more. I had all the legislators in last year, minus one who did not come in. But at the end of the day, the Fair Share Funding Act was 2 years ago. There's a new equation for the state funding. It would be great if they could put a delta in there for the amount of business support each district gets. I don't think that's in the funding model. And so if we could somehow get that little delta in there, it would help. But again, we are not, we're not alone. There are districts that have worse situations than we do. There are also districts that are very excited about the new Fair Share Funding Act.
Yes. Well, so this goes back a little bit to the problem is that
that means
right.
That's why we're not.
For everyone,
I
almost feel like it's set up that way on purpose because for every winner district, there's a loser district, and the loser districts might go complain, but the winner districts are like, "Hey, we're really happy with this. Don't change things."
Right. So, I mean, you think. We might get districts that look like us to join forces, but how many of us profile versus not us profile are there? And they're the ones, if we get more money, they get less.
Right.
If they get more,
we get less.
Right. The added bonus is that we're doing well. And so, academically. Right. So you don't have the argument of...
Look how much you're hurting us.
Right, because we're obviously doing well with what we have.
And in the back of their minds, well, it's not in the back of their minds. It's part of their policy. It's part of their decision-making. You can afford it. So
I can't afford it. Maybe you can.
You love them.
No, I know
you love them. You can afford it. So afford it. There are people that need it, that need a lot more than you. That's the fundamental problem.
Well, and go back to your exact conversation. You, Loveland, can afford it, but you, Kathy, can't, and you, Kevin, can't. And by the way, you have to vote and talk to each other about it.
Cancel each other out in the process, right?
Yeah.
So thanks, state.
Okay, so the question at this point, it's 11:45. I said we'd get out of here by 12. Kevin said, oh, we'll be.
Well,
way
11
before
o'clock.
that. We were-
It's way before 12.
I think what the board needs to do at this point is talk about when they need to talk more about this. The way it's currently set up, January 10th organizational meeting, obviously we can have another financial discussion there. The January 18th and 31st meetings that were proposed are if there was a decision for a May levy, the 18th would be a vote to certify and the 31st would be a vote to put on the ballot. I'm not saying that that's at all a decision that's been discussed. I'm just saying that's the process. To me, it would be, I don't know if it would be wise to say at the 18th, we're going to have a community meeting first.
Why can't we go to work on scheduling a community meeting for early January?
Well, we're not anything until January 10th. We haven't organized. We're still board members. I believe there could be a meeting that is a community input meeting. I don't believe, I'd have to check the legalities of this. I don't believe we could have a board meeting with 5 members present and call it a board meeting and call it to order. I don't think we can.
It doesn't need to be.
I understand. I'm just saying if you wanted 5 board members to be there, it has to be a called meeting. We can't just 5 of us show up for a community meeting because you would in fact be discussing board business.
But then we'd be in different areas. I thought it was that we can't all be
I think
together.
it's a
I don't know if
I think it's a shady.
the organization.
Walk over and.
We could do it with 2 though.
2 board members could. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying, first of all, we cannot call a meeting because we haven't organized yet. Second of all, I think it would be a bad idea to have 5 board members there
At a
just
non-meeting.
because it appears you're having a meeting and discussing board business.
So, okay, the
But yes.
point on it, Mike could organize a community meeting and 2 of us.
2
could
board
attend.
members could go. Yes.
Or Mike could organize a community meeting and we could on January 10th make that a board meeting.
I'm
He's talking
just,
about one before January 10th.
I'm just
Oh,
thinking.
okay.
you know,
Could
get
we
on
for
hear
with it.
from the community
Get on
before
January.
we
Gotcha.
get into our full
Can we do the
discussion?
organizational meeting earlier than the 10th would be good? I know we talked about this, but I can't.
I don't believe that I'm available the week earlier than that. So that might make that question. Let me just look real
I
fast.
think it's very
The
difficult.
next one is January 3rd and I'm not available January 3rd. All right.
Can't we just use different rooms and have out of the 5 of us or wants to come?
Then how do you
different
collate that
groups.
information? I still think we're saying board member, put that together. It's a
Or
meeting.
if
I
Mike,
think it's
if Mike holds
just-
it, 2 of us are there. If it's something we could broadcast, the rest of us could watch it on,
Sure.
just observe it on
It's just
YouTube.
that only 2 of us could interact
Right.
with them.
Well, and you could all be there. Right?
Well, I think
And-
he's cautioning against
I think
us
I-
being there.
I can't be a member of an audience.
The optics at least are.
No, I'm with it. I mean, dude, this is why the whole thing's ridiculous to me.
Yes, you can be. We can all 5 members be together. The sunshine law says we cannot discuss board business. So what constitutes, like if you participate as an audience member and Kevin answers and
I won't ask Kevin any questions. I'm just there for the public. Just there for the public.
I think it's safer to see if there's a
I understand.
community meeting that could be called, could be broadcast, could be recorded, and we could all watch it after.
And the
And
value of it is
members
not
are there.
our
I just
discussion
think that's-
anyway.
Right.
The value is to listen to
That's
Right.
true.
the community.
That's really,
So
and that was really my
And Mike
point.
has all the answers, so if Mike is there, then we can.
Yeah. Well,
Remember how that went with Amy?
How would we all feel about an early January session like that?
How would you feel, Mike?
Oh, it's great. I'd love to hear them. And finding a way that even people that are not attending can participate. Sure, the more the merrier. I'd love to hear from everybody.
It looks to me like you would have kids go back to school on the 2nd or the 3rd,
Third of
the
it.
3rd. So it feels to me like you would have the 4th, the 5th, or the 9th for such a meeting.
It's the 5th of Thursday.
It's a
Yes,
Thursday.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Cinco de Janeiro.
Well, it's good because I can't be there on the 5th, so that's perfect. Then we solved that
We're down
problem.
to that.
That's why I picked it.
Well, I think the 9th is a little late to get any kind of organized thing to report on the.
Yeah, right, right.
So you thinking the 5th? So
Which is-
who
yeah.
could be there as a board member? Eric can't. You could be there. Could be there.
I can be there. I'm also happy to be one of the ones that doesn't end up being there if we need that. So I'm either way, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to,
And
I'm willing to not
happy to watch or be a lurker, as they say.
Are we good to go with something like this? Is Michael pull it off?
Yeah, like
I
it.
mean, that's a sense that we've gotten a lot of information today. We have a lot of things to digest, and that would be another piece. Again, not sure how valid it would be if there happens to be some other source of information for us. By the 10th, it will help us inform what we're doing in January. If there's a clear cut, okay, we're not thinking of May, then, the 18th and the 31st become an object of discussion as well. So
it'd be worthwhile to ask our council about that in terms of,
Attendance.
if there's a way to.
I think I've asked often enough, but we'll certainly ask again that if 2 board members are there,
It's certainly important. It'd be great if we could all be there.
Right. Or even if because of the lack of organization, could we call it a board meeting that we haven't organized yet? That question too, I
Right.
think is.
Yeah, I'll ask. I'll see. You've got the nuance where a couple of you are parents too. So you get to play the role of
Right.
parent as well. So I can dig into a little bit, just make sure we do it the proper way.
I mean, I know we have, all board members have been at some of the planning commission kinds of things, some of the district building kind of plan things. It's just, we can't have a meeting. And I don't like the being in different rooms. And then it seems like it's very clearly set up for board members to get information and then discuss it. So I think it's better if it's an open thing.
I was just thinking more accessibility to us and allowing people to be heard.
Yeah, it can end up being a better thing anyway to do breakout sessions. People tend to,
I suppose
you get more people to participate when you do breakouts than just one large gathering, and only the really bold will step up and say something.
Yeah, you get a little more participation. I'll call.
All right.
Make sure if we can get everybody there, even the breakouts. And if we can, then maybe the 9th is better. I'll get all the logistics figured out.
I do think you're going to be told, though, we could be there, but we can't call it a meeting. We can't formally call to order, have a meeting.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the purpose of it
I
anyway.
understand,
So
but it needs to be a legal question.
we can't have it be legally interpreted as a meeting, and then we didn't follow the rules of the meeting.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yes.
That the auditor could say, you met the qualifications of the meeting. There are 5 of you there, and you were talking about school business. That's
Now,
a meeting,
that
whether you
being
called it or
said-
not, and you're in violation of the law
Right.
now.
That being said, the remedy through the Sunshine Law is that any action that you're taking, is taken during that time is invalid. If there's no action taken, then there's no remedy necessary. So I'm just cautioning that we cannot officially call a meeting and have it on the books as a board meeting.
But you'll talk to legal to clarify with.
Anything else? I think we've clarified through the meeting what you think the next steps will be. And January 5th may be a community meeting, may or may not be attended by whoever can attend. But the next time that we will see each other is January 10th. It's our organizational meeting. And I believe that it is 5:00 for the budget hearing and 6:00 for the board meeting. Mr. Giuffre may have said 5:30 for the budget hearing. It usually doesn't take very long, but just be prepared that prior to the 6:00 meeting, when you must be there, there will be a budget hearing. So.
Great.
Okay. All right.
Well done.
Have a great rest of your weekend. We would need to adjourn the meeting at 11:55.
So moved.
Second.
All those in
Aye.
favor? Any opposed? Then we're adjourned. Enjoy the